Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to another Critical Conversations. I'm teaching on the move. We today we have the pleasure of talking to Dr. John Aden, a historian, an educator, a scholar whose work bridges West African history, global experiences, and community-centered education. He earned his doctorate in African history from Indiana University in Bloomington and has curated museums, taught across independent and collegiate spaces, and created widely used public history resources that make Africa's past accessible and powerfully relevant to today's youth. Again, welcome Dr. John Aden to the stage.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, Dr. Aden. yes. So good to see you. And I'm going to go ahead and start with our questions. The first one. Many people still struggle to understand the African role in the transatlantic slave trade. And from your research, which African kingdoms or groups were most involved in selling captives, and who were the ones that were being sold?
Wow. One, thanks for this question. Like, this is one of the hottest questions that Africanist historians get about the transatlantic slave trade. And I know the long, short answer. I'll throw some names out there, and then I'm just going to explore why they're significant. There are, as your question alluded to, there are kingdoms that existed in West Africa, but there are also what we might call state systems. So sometimes there were city states. They weren't parts of kingdoms, but they were very powerful forces in the transatlantic slave trade. And then you also have what we call acephalous or headless societies, right? Stateless societies they weren't kingdom based. They were neighborhood or town based. And sometimes those towns might have mutual defense pacts with one another, oral agreements, sometimes written agreements about mutual defense. And so when we look at a map of West Africa, like, it's a patchwork quilt. Sometimes it's kingdoms and state systems, sometimes it's stateless societies, and they all ended up kind of funneling people toward the coast. So when we think about a map of, West Africa, many of the place names you might be familiar with, like Gold Coast, for instance, or the Windward Coast, the Bight of Benin. Like, when we're thinking about what I like to call the elbow of West Africa, where Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, Togo, Benin all kind of meet, right? Really, it's Nigeria and Cameroon that meet. That elbow area right there, there's something like 480 languages that are spoken in that area today. Right. And so there were so many, like too many to name, but I'll name a few of them. So some of the, kingdoms on the coast were actually Ouida, or sometimes it's referred to as Wida, was a kingdom that spun up in the 18th century explicitly to take advantage of the transatlantic slave trade. Like, this wasn't a kingdom that existed before, and it emerged just to play a merchant role in this trade. Right. But then you've also got the Oyo Empire. You've got the Kingdom of Benin, also referred to as Edo. So then you've got some names I'm just going to throw out that people might not be so familiar with. The Itsekiri Kingdom of Wari, in Nigeria's western delta, was really important. So we think about the fan as the delta, expands into the Atlantic Ocean. And then on the western side, so on this side of it, if we're thinking about it, I'm making sure I get my presentation right. But there was a kingdom there called Wari, and it played this huge role. And then there are other states like the Ijaw and the Isoko were also important states. And within it, they had like confederacies or kingdoms. So the Nimbe, Bani, the Orika, and also Brass. There's a state in modern Nigeria called Brass State. And this is one of those states, and its origin was in the transatlantic slave trade period, right? And so there's also the Kalabari Kingdom. Sometimes it's just referred to as Calabar. Then there's the Ibibio people, and within the Ibibio, culture group, there are these city states. So one of them was called Ikat, and the other one was called Anang. So I'm just talking Nigeria, parts of Benin and Togo, right? That doesn't include any of the interior states. And my doctoral thesis research looked at the kingdom of Segu, which was a kingdom that traded in the transatlantic slave trade era, but it's in internal Mali, like deep in the interior. And then there are a lot of other kingdoms and states that existed, but they were like not at the coast. And so I just want to expand on your question really quickly by suggesting that, not really suggesting, but just stating that there's this kind of conversational relationship between these coastal African elites and elites in the interior, right? And some of the coastal African elites were down with the slave trade, but others weren't. And I know we'll get to this later in some of the other questions you'll pose, but there were some societies that did not use slavery as organizing labor principle. Like, as historians, we tend to refer to these like slavery as one type of labor system. Actually, it's many types of labor systems based on the culture, and there's lots of other factors. So you have the trans-Saharan trade, but then you have slavery as it's organized in many West African societies, and at the coast was organized differently than in the interior. And there's lots of like economic reasons for that. But also, it's important to keep in mind that African slavery was not like European slavery. So I just do really quickly a thumbnail sketch on like the origins of slavery as a labor system. And one thing, if people don't walk away with anything else, one thing to walk away with is an understanding that slavery only emerges when you have capital, accumulation. Let me not say capital, but accumulation. So if you have intensive farming such that some people are able to like they can accumulate a lot of surplus, whatever the crop is, at that point, people in world history realize, oh snap, we can force other people to do all this hard work instead of us doing it ourselves, right? So the accumulation piece is really in world history where we see slavery emerge. And I'm going to put a pin in this because there are some people like this, and I got a YouTube video I'm working on, but there are people who have been saying, oh, slavery happened all over the world. It happened on every continent. No, it didn't. And even on the African continent, there were societies that did not practice slavery because why? They didn't have agricultural accumulation. So all the hunter-gatherer societies, none of them had slavery. And it's a list, and it's like, it's not short. I couldn't go off the head with all the people. I would have to literally read it. There's people in West Africa. The Jola were one group. The Balanta are another group. They were in West Africa. They didn't practice slavery as a labor system. And we can even go farther. Like, if people are really interested, there's an amazing book by a Senegalese scholar named Sylvain Diouf. And I'm going to try and put it in the chat while I'm talking right now. But I'm just going to put it in the chat right now. Sylvain Diouf has a book called Fighting the Slave Trade, West African Strategies, where basically she talks about how these societies organized to stamp the slave trade out, and they tried to harden their own societies, villages, towns, neighborhoods, cities against the slave trade. This is not a narrative we get taught anywhere. The assumption is that, oh, Europeans came in, they had all the best technology, and they hit Africans upside the head and brought them to the coast. We know that's not necessarily true either. Like, that didn't happen a whole lot. But in terms of what did Africans do in their own societies, they resisted the transatlantic slave trade in a lot of ways. And this book goes into the strategies in a lot of detail. Now, those types of details emerge because of a combination of oral histories that are collected and, oral testimonies that are collected. And I can always draw a distinction between those two things because they're not the same thing. We tend to use the phrase oral tradition interchangeably with what we actually mean to be oral traditions and oral testimonies and oral histories. So all those three terms are used differently by social scientists because otherwise we run into certain problems trying to interpret what we're hearing in the signal and to separate the noise from the signal, right? But so in terms of when we think about the transatlantic slave trade, like there are so many societies that resisted the slave trade very intently. Um, we know, for instance, when we say, well, what do resistance strategies look like? I'll just touch on those lightly. We know that there were armed guards that accompanied women who went to the riverside to wash clothing, or if they had wells that were outside of the villages or towns or neighborhoods, then they were accompanied. There were tracking teams that communities developed to go get people back after they were captured. And then they built fortified, hardened walls around many of their towns and neighborhoods so that people couldn't just come in and take people, right? And so these are all strategies Africans use to resist the transatlantic slave trade. But now it's important, if you're looking at a map of West Africa, the northern bend of the Niger River is important because north of it is it's all in the Sahel zone, but north of it is the Sahara Desert. And so you have to understand that, from time immemorial, as far back as we have any types of records, archaeology, material culture, and in oral history, and eventually written records, we know that the people north of the Niger River were largely pastoralists. And they would come into the agricultural zone to those cities and towns and neighborhoods to trade. They would trade the meat from their flocks. They mostly kept goats and cattle, but also camels. And they would trade that meat. They would trade milk in exchange for agricultural products like sorghum or millet, any of the green vegetables that were grown in West Africa. Now, that was in good times. But in lean times, when water was scarce, then those pastoralists who lived north of the Niger River, they would stash their flocks in the Atlas Mountains, and they would hop on their camels and they would raid these agricultural settlements. So those settlements had reasons to harden their defenses against those people, right? Now, this is more to do with the trans-Saharan trade, but some of those people ended up either going toward the Senegal River Basin, and they would have go down that river basin toward the Atlantic, or they were sent much farther south. So Segu is a kingdom. Karta is a kingdom that's important in these parts of West Africa. And then, you've got the Jollof kingdoms. There are a lot of kingdoms. And these are, for the most part, kingdoms in what we call the Mande speaking world, right? The Mande speaking world, even though I'll be blunt, as an African American, 80% of our DNA comes from Nigeria. But for anyone who's done their DNA test, they'll see Mali crop up, or they'll see Senegal crop up, or they'll see Ivory Coast crop up, or they'll see Niger or Burkina Faso, right? Any of those places were the areas where, when the Mali Empire broke up, and I should go back, when the Ghana Kingdom broke up, right, from the 2nd to the 10th centuries, the Ghana Kingdom breaks up, those people start migrating away from this part of the Sahara, and they move south. They move southeast and southwest and south central. And so when they do, they set up new communities. And then when the Mali Empire emerges, it pulls all of those communities together because many of those communities founded their own kingdoms. And so Mali is an empire, meaning it's a collection of kingdoms, right? And so then Mali combines these all under one umbrella. And so all of that's before the transatlantic slave trade ever happens, right? And so, Mali collapses, and then Songhai comes into existence around 1464, right? And then the Songhai Empire tries to hold on to those kingdoms. And this is at the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, because the Portuguese are on the coast of West Africa in around 1440. And so these things all come together. So why I mentioned the Mande speaking world, because Nigeria, no shade to Nigeria, it's hugely significant culturally, but for many of our people, we have Mande culture roots at some point, because the Mande speaking world is huge. It's maybe 11 countries. So it's Senegal, it's the Gambia, it's Southern Mauritania, it's the Republic of Mali, it's Niger, it's Burkina Faso, it's Ivory Coast, it's also Sierra Leone, Liberia, Guinea-Bissau, and Guinea-Conakry, right? That's 12 countries. That's off the dome, right? That area is huge, and culturally is very significant. many of the people who ended up being taken into the Gullah Geechee corridor during the transatlantic slave trade, they came from the Mande speaking world. They were rice pickers, right? They were rice growers, both dry and wet rice. And so this culture zone is huge. And a lot of African Americans are not yet aware of how significant this culture zone is. Now, in that culture zone, there's all different types of peoples, political structures, as you name it. The people at the coast were the ones who had the vested interest in, engaging in the slave trade. Mostly the elites in those societies were invested in engaging in the slave trade. But as the trade wears on, there are some, stories that Europeans wrote down where a brother might have a younger sibling and they were feuding at the time the slave trade emerged, and one brother sold the other brother's whole family into slavery, right? So we want to keep in mind, like, sometimes that happened. Like, there are people who are like, our ancestors didn't sell each other into slavery. Yes, they did. But capture was also a foundational part of this. And I want to just highlight really quickly, because I don't want to steal all the thunder from the other questions, but you have this kind of push-pull dynamic where you have elites at the coast and they want goods in the interior. But the people in the interior are the middlemen. They set the prices. All 4 of West Africa's major gold fields are not at the coast. They're in the interior. So if those elites wanted to display their wealth ostentatiously, how are they going to do that? They had to go through these middlemen and women, and sometimes they didn't want to do that. So when the Europeans show up with guns and they're like, hey, why don't you go knock off those middlemen that have been bugging you all along? Many of those coastal elites are like, bet, give me those guns and we'll go into the interior, right? But the gun story is also nuanced because, a lot of times I was in a social media room the other day and someone was claiming that Europeans had the best technology and they had the guns and they just went to the interior and kidnapped Africans. And I was just like, no, that's not what happened. The Dutch introduced the blunderbuss, or the elephant gun. You probably seen as a gun with a really flared mouth for the musket ball to exit, and it was short, right? They introduced the blunderbuss into the kingdom of Benin in 1600. In the year 1600, maybe there were 1,200 blast furnaces in the royal blast furnaces in the Benin kingdom, in the capital city alone. 1,200, and they blasted 24/7. That's how much they were into iron. Those blacksmiths in the Benin kingdom reverse engineered the musket and started making their own gunpowder. West Africans were on parity with European technology until 1884, when the Maxim gun was invented. So Africans were often the landlords and the Europeans were the strangers. And actually, there's a book by a scholar named George Brooks. It's called Landlords and Strangers. And it's about how African elites at the coast set the terms for European engagement. Because Europeans realized pretty quickly they could build a fort, but Africans could destabilize that as a point of commerce by not just showing up in those spaces. And so Europeans were often played against one another by African elites. And so this is a huge part of that story. So, I mean, obviously, this is something I can go into a lot more detail about, like, course offerings on just the transatlantic slave trade easily stretch into 12, 15, 20 lectures that are all an hour long, because that's how complicated this history is. But these were the ones who were selling captives, and then, who were the ones being sold, for the most part. Now, this is a difficult conversation to have. Scholars estimate that, maybe 75% of the people who were enslaved by Africans in internal African slavery were women, and they were enslaved by other women, right? And so this changes the way we think we necessarily have to reason through the transatlantic slave trade. But a lot of women were being exchanged until European habits changed in terms of what type of work they wanted done in the Americas and what type of skill sets the people who are being taken should have in order to produce success. And that's a whole separate story. But now here's the difficult part. I'll say 2 things. One, West African pre-colonial slavery was not plantation based. It was household based. So there were a small number of persons who might be enslaved, and there were really 3 or 4 reasons why you could be enslaved, like as punishment for a crime, to pay off a debt, or as a captive in war were the 3 major ones. And the fourth one, which we don't have time to get into tonight, the fourth one was based on the marriage system, which is a whole separate discussion about how slavery emerges out of polygamous married relationships and expectations for how elites would show off their wealth and their social status, right? I don't hear hardly anyone talking about this online, but this is a huge part of, like, so who was taken in the trade? And then the last piece I'll say is that, and this is a part that's difficult to talk about, but 25% of all the people in African societies in the pre-colonial period had low social status. They had poor upward social mobility prospects. And it was the elites in African societies, the wealthy people in African societies, who kept that 25% in that low social status position. So those were some of the first people to be sold, because the elites in the society thought, oh, I can do without these people because they're not powerful. And so a lot of times this goes to another question that, I know you might pose. There's this idea that African societies were egalitarian and, people were largely equal, but we know that that's true in some ways, but not in other major ways, right? And so there was also always class status within African societies. There were people who had accumulated more, people who had accumulated less. And so that's kind of the long, short answer. It's complicated. To do it right.
As we try to tell these people on social media on a daily basis that try to rewrite history. So I can listen to you talk for the longest. I'm telling you the truth. I'm gonna try to bring you up as much as we possibly can. So I appreciate that information. So we're gonna go in. Tika, you here? We'll go to the next question. So Dr. Aden, are you able to quickly run down the critical role West and Central African civilizations played in early world trade networks? And can you start with the year and century we need to begin our research on? Now, just so you understand the context of why I asked that question specifically. I'm big on chronology, and I learned that chronology literally will help you, like Dr. Henry Clark says, tell your historical time of day. And if you learn where things happen and when things happen, both geographically and the chronology, the time period, it'll help you get a better understanding as to what happened back then and what role we play in the world today based on what happened back then. So you want me to repeat the question? Or you good?
Okay. Good. Let's go. Yeah. I think the best single source to look at is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. I'm just gonna, that's a mouthful, so I'm gonna put it in the chat real quick. I think I spelled that right, but Google will autocorrect if not. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is a cargo manifest from the 1st century BCE in the Red Sea area, right? And so this was a text that people in the Mediterranean knew about. And it was written in Greek, and it listed all of the things that were being traded in the Horn of East Africa. So now not West Africa, but East Africa, right? And so this is one of the oldest trade documents we have from African history. And it's a staple when you go study African history at the graduate school level. This Periplus is important because it gives us a sense for, well, who is exchanging what? It also shows like the massive regions around adjacent to Africa that Africans were pulling products from. So, to your point, Shaka, like one of the assumptions is that Africa only traded internally and Africa was only internally focused. But we know Africa shaped and impacted the world. from the peopling of the planet to, how trade occurred. And so we know that there are merchants, there are Greco-Roman merchants, there are merchants in the Horn of East Africa, there are people in India, there are people in the Levant, right? Present day, Lebanon, Syria, etc. Where present day Israel is, etc. These people knew about these goods, and they were, and so what's contained in? I mean, you can go look it up. It's for free. You can find it for free online. The Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is maybe like, I don't know, 4 pages of text. And they talk about rhinoceros horn and elephant horn and gold and enslaved persons and different types of shells, glass beads. There was a discovery recently by a Nigerian author that West Africans were making their own blown glass beads before the Europeans got there. So when the Europeans try to force Africans to accept European products, Africans are like, why? We don't need what you have. Right. But the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea is important for that. Now, I mean, the broader history of the continent is that the Swahili coast is very important. There were people, using dhows, which are these special types of boats that have a triangular sail. We know that the Europeans figured out how to tack into and against the wind in their sailing practice by observing the sails that were working in the Indian Ocean. And those are African, I mean, we can't say who invented them first, but we know Africans were heavily using dhows. We see them concentrated on the east coast of East Africa. So you're talking about present day Kenya, present day Zanzibar, parts of Somalia, parts of Tanzania. So there are trade networks there. There are massive trade works in southeastern Africa with the Great Zimbabwe civilization, and there are 2 major city-states that emerge on the East African coast. One is Sofala and the other is Kilwa. And we know that as the Portuguese attempted to establish trading, to force trade to come to them, African merchants just rerouted the trade and sent it elsewhere. We know that African ivory from elephant tusks was preferred by people for wedding gifts in India. Indian women demanded wedding trousseaux, wedding gifts that had these bangles, these bracelets and anklets that were thick, they're thick, made and carved, made out of East African ivory, because Indian elephants' tusks don't hold the carve. They don't hold the carving as well as the African ivory did. So we know East Africans are figuring out ways to ship ivory into India. And it's ivory, Indian men and their fathers who are thinking about how to transfer a dowry to the person they want their son to marry. They're collecting this, right? So we know that. We also know, like we see, I mean, I've seen this in Shanghai in several museums. There are paintings of African mariners scaling the riggings of ships and offloading cargo in China from African dhows. So we know that the Chinese were trading with East Africa. Like, that's just East Africa, right? That's not Northeast Africa. I won't even touch on Egypt or Kemet. Like, that's a whole separate conversation. But it's important to note that, like, there's a new museum. You probably heard about it in the news, where all of the artifacts, 65,000 plus artifacts from King Tut's tomb, are all on display in a single museum in Cairo now. And a lot of the brilliant blue mineral that we see is called lapis lazuli. We know that that was not indigenous to the African continent. It's mined in Afghanistan. So we know that Africans were trading really far away from the continent, and that people were also seeking to trade with the continent from a long time, back in the past. I'll just touch on West Africa really quickly. In West Africa, you've got, copper, and copper was used to make what's called an ingot. An ingot is a type of cast bar that was used as an early form of currency, and these could be stacked on top of one another. We know a lot about them because we've discovered their archaeological remains in West Africa, but also there are Portuguese, merchant ships and slave ships that sunk and were loaded down with these. And we don't know if they may have played a role in sinking these ships, but This was an early form of currency. We know that cowrie shells were also sold. Cola nuts, very important. Cola nuts, there are two forms in West Africa. There's a red type and there's a white type. The red type, if you give that as a gift to someone, it means you intend war and violence. And the white type means peace. And so there's a lively marketplace all across West Africa for cola nuts. Cola nuts are consumed by farmers and it increases your energy dramatically. Cola nuts actually have two things in them: caffeine and then thiobromide, which is a chemical compound that's found in caffeinated teas, and it's a stimulant. So people would use that to farm. And then, of course, you got like all measure of like fruits and vegetables. West Africans were familiar with diseases like scurvy, which could cause horrible deformations of the bones, skeletal bones in the body. And so all of these are options in terms of trade. And then, I haven't even talked about the occupational specialists, right? More important than, we really, as scholars, we don't use the term tribe to talk about African societies. We prefer the term ethnic group because Europeans intended the term tribe as a racial epithet.
Can you say that one more time, Doc? Can you say that one more time? We don't use what now? We don't use what?
We don't use the word tribe when we are referring to African social organization, because this was a term that Europeans revived from the Romans and intended as a racial slur. They intended it to imply an unsophisticatedness and a smallness of thought and capacity. But, you got societies in southeastern and western Nigeria that have millions of members in the same ethnic group, right? So we use the term ethnic group instead. Now, the Romans did use the term tribe, and it has its own distinct history. So maybe at some point we can talk about that. But in the colonial period, once Europeans realized white supremacy and skin privilege are technologies they can weaponize against the depictions of our ancestors, then they used this term tribe mercilessly. Now, I will add one caveat just for anyone who's from the Anglophone African world on the continent. Like, if you are from Ghana or you are from like Kenya or the Gambia, people there use the word tribe to describe ethnic groups. And that's a legacy of British colonialism, right? And so I just want to put that out there. There are some Africans you will encounter who will use the term tribe to describe social organization. Now, here's the other thing. Your ethnic group wasn't even the most important part of your identity for the vast majority of pre-colonial Africans. Your occupation, your clan identity, like these could be far more important. And so typically across West Africa, you had, nobles, and the noble class was comprised of farmers, but also warriors and merchants. And then you typically had casted artisans. These would include your blacksmiths, your wood carvers. Usually in most societies in the Mande speaking world, your blacksmiths and your wood carvers were the same people. You also had your leather workers. And there's indigenous terms for all of these. Blacksmiths were referred to as numu or numukyo if you were male. Typically blacksmiths were male. There were potters. There were also leather workers, garankyo. There were fisher folk. There were people who ferried people across major waterways. That was their occupation. And when I talk about occupation being important, it's because in pre-colonial Africa, there were highly differentiated economies. A highly differentiated economy is one where you're so skilled at what you do to produce a craft or provide a service that you don't have to grow crops for food. You can trade the product of what you make for food. This is a highly sophisticated economy, and we see this all over the African continent, but we see it a lot in West and Central Africa. So I'll maybe put a pin in it there, but there's a lot that's being traded. Of course, people are being traded too. I don't want to ignore that. Internally African societies had a slave trade that had its own logic. It didn't look anything like what Europeans would develop in the transatlantic world. And so that's a whole separate story. I had several lectures just to talk about African labor systems. But we see many, many things. Of course, there's a lively trade in pelts. There's metalwork. So there are coppersmiths, there are goldsmiths, there are blacksmiths that are operating in West Africa. I want to just say this thing really quickly. Sometimes I've heard people on social media say, oh yeah, all the wealth from the Mali Empire came from slaves. We don't know that. All of the records that we have in the oral traditions of the Mande speaking peoples state that like these were occupational family groups. So to illustrate this, like when I lived in Mali for 3 years, I lived in a family compound, and in one of the homes in that compound, there was a family of goldsmiths, and he was teaching his sons how to smith gold. And they procured gold on their own. Like they did it internal to the family because it was a part of their family secrets, right? Or this trade secrets. So I know, maybe at some point we'll have a question about guilds. When we think about guilds and fraternities and sororities in African societies, like they largely emerged to protect trade secrets on how things were produced and where to source particularly valuable items. And so the goldsmiths, they harvested their own gold. They evaluated it on their own. A lot of people assume because there are a lot of what we call artisanal miners. I'll just go put that in the chat. In Central Africa now, they're mining tungsten, some of these precious metals that go into our cell phones, because they see pictures of people and children particularly mining, in shallow pit mines or shallow shaft mines all over Central Africa. They make the assumption that this is how gold was mined in the Mali Empire, but we don't know that. So I just wanted to point that out.
Hey, like I said, just the knowledge. I see the chat right now. Everybody's geeking out right now. It's just refreshing to hear a scholar get down with us and tell us exactly what we need to hear. So I get it. I'm gonna start with our next question. So from your research, which African kingdom or groups were most involved in selling captives, and who were the ones being sold?
Oh, I think I answered that one already.
We did.
That was at the beginning. Yeah, where I listed like Ouida, the Segu Kingdom, Karta, right, etc. Yeah.
So number two, much of Africa, much of African and African American history has been told through colonial or Western frameworks. How do you approach decolonizing these narratives in your teaching and research so that African voices are centered in their own history?
Yeah. Whew. This one, I love this question. I love this question. Now I'm going to say something that just like walk with me. So it's going to sound sacrilegious, but the vast majority of people who did African history were white Americans for most of the 20th century. Okay. Now, I'm not trying to suggest black people weren't studying Africa like they were, but like at the research level in universities. Now, here's the hard part. The hard part is that the standards to be an Africanist scholar in the academy today are very high. In order to speak authoritatively about Africa's past, there's some things you have to do. They're not negotiable. You have to learn an African language. You have to go live with the people you're studying. And you have to spend time in the National Archives there. You go visit the National Museum of Art if you have the ability to. Like, it's a broader project of research. And I want to just say, like, one of the important, I'm going to go on a brief tangent. One of the important figures who made this shift happen inside African studies was a man named Franz Boas. Now, Franz Boas he was Polish. I believe he was Polish. He immigrated to the United States in the late 19th century. And he studied a group of Pacific Coast Native Americans called the Kwakiutl. And the Kwakiutl, there were assumptions about indigenous peoples that other Europeans in the American Anthropological Association had made. They assumed all these people were primitive peoples. Right, you see me throwing up the air quotes. No people are primitive. Let me just state that for the record. The other thing I want to state is that the whole idea of civilization is a colonial project. The construct of civilization as a word, as a term, was coined by Europeans to differentiate themselves from everyone they believed to be lower species than they were. So when we use the term civilization, we're buying into a construct that's colonial in origin. Now, I have a whole separate conversation about Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, who I respect a lot. And there are other people, Dr. Ben, I mean, there's a number of scholars who in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they bought into this concept because they wanted to push back against the idea that Africans lack civilization. But the whole construct is white supremacist. Okay. Now, I just want to put a pin in that because sometimes we buy the ground that's being fought over, and then we don't realize we're replicating the same white supremacist constructs that don't even apply to our ancestry. Right. So all societies are civilized. Well, Franz Boas tried telling this to the white Americans when he was also Jewish, right? So there's a ton of anti-Semitism in the American academic academy at the turn of the 20th century. And as a result of that, like he was the president of the AAA, the American Anthropological Association, and they removed him because he was Jewish. They also removed him because he was making these kinds of discoveries. Well, Boas went and lived with the Kwakiutl and he learned their language. Instead of being what we call an armchair anthropologist who just read in books, oh, there's this tribe, right? There's this tribe over there in the Pacific Northwest coast, and they don't have any systems of law or governance. They don't even have language. And people didn't know what they were talking about. Boas thought, let me go out there and find out. So he changed, now, was he significant? Yes, because he ended up having hundreds of students, and his students fanned out all over the world, but they had different assumptions. They assumed all cultures have their own internal logics, and all cultures are sophisticated. Just those two things alone refuted what white supremacy and colonialism was promoting about indigenous people and Black people all over the world, right? And so I mentioned Boas because, just from personal experience, I know a ton of scholars who are they're white Americans, but they speak they speak the languages of the societies that they are exploring, and they've done this kind of deeper level of research. So the bar is a lot higher. Now, I don't want to sound like an apologist for white people in this endeavor, because have there been people of European descent who have distorted Africa's past? Yes, absolutely. Right. And is it something that current scholars have to constantly guard against? Yes, it is. Now, all that's all the pretext to answer the question, right? So what's deep is that when you're in grad school, you learn how to read text for biases. Now, social scientists have identified, and I won't try and grab a link for this. Social scientists have identified 188 cognitive biases that human beings engage in on a regular basis, right? And I'm going to put this link in the chat real quick so you can post it out. Let me just copy it. All right, I'm going to put this real quick in the private chat so you can post it to the group. So this is a link to all of the cognitive biases that human beings have. 188 of them have been discovered by social scientists across innumerable fields in the social sciences. And here's the rub. Our brains are only capable of knowing about 4 at any one time, which means we're going to offend other people. Right? And we're going to make these mistakes. But once you're aware of them, you can try to consciously counteract some of the effects of these biases. So why am I mentioning this? In grad school, we are taught how to read colonial texts for bias. Some of the things that Europeans are describing when they wrote in their travel logs about the African societies they were working in, some of those things are historically accurate, and they're verified by African oral traditions, right? And oral histories. The key is that you don't just take the text by itself. And this is why it's so essential to learn African languages. And there's all kinds of apps now. You can learn an African language if you want, And I will submit, I'm just gonna drop this truth bomb real quick in it for the chat. Like Africa's population is gonna double to 2.7 billion people by 2050, and it's gonna triple to 5.4 billion people by the end of the century. This century and the next century are Africa's centuries. The rest of this century. And so learning an African language, you cannot go wrong. Right now, it took me 8 years to learn Bamana. The language that I learned is the language that was spoken in the Mali Empire. I'll just put that in the chat real quick. And like Bamana was hard. It's a tonal language. For every syllable possible, there's 5 tones: 2 high tones, 2 low tones, and a neutral tone. Change the tone, change the meaning of a word. When Europeans interacted with Africans, they assumed they were just speaking gibberish. Right? Not realizing African languages operate on a super high degree of efficiency because you're compressing a whole lot of knowledge into tones that change, right? So when I big up like white American scholars who are studying Africa, it's because I know they've done the work, right? And then there's the peer review side.
Dr. John,
Yeah.
I don't mean to cut in, but I think this is a very important part, and it actually goes along with one of my questions that I wanted to ask. Leo Wiener's work was heavily based on the comparison of linguistics, primarily with the Mende and certain Mesoamerican tribes. Can you please explain that initially his work is flawed because the Bambara and Mende language is a tonal language? So if he did not know the language and he did not sit and study with the Mende, right? How could he have known that different tones mean different meanings and then make a false comparison with Mesoamerican languages, which is the basis of his whole book, which is the premise and the basis of Ivan Van Sertima's submission, and the other scholar, which was Wokenoff, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep, Alexander von Wertenau. Yep. I mean, you really explained it. I guess not a whole lot for me to say other than to just co-sign that. Well, I'll add another wrinkle.
Okay.
Dr. Van Sertima, it's always difficult to have this conversation, but Dr. Van Sertima earned a master's degree at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, or SOAS, as it's popularly known. And his master's thesis was on East African languages. He never studied West African languages. Right? He never visited Mali. He never talked to local scholars. He never interviewed griots. So when he's making these claims about written scripts that are Mande that show up in the Yucatan Peninsula, like with all due respect, like he just simply did not have the basis to make that claim. Right? So that's the difficult part. We look at the Europeans like Alexander von Wertenau, for instance, or Leo Wiener. These were armchair anthropologists. They didn't speak any of the languages of the Yucatan Peninsula where the Olmecs were. They didn't visit the Yucatan Peninsula. They didn't interview any local people for their oral histories. Like it all starts to fall apart from there, right? And they didn't do any of that research in West Africa either. So when they're making these claims, they're what we call armchair anthropologists. They were just pontificating, but they didn't actually do the legwork. They didn't know how to do the research. And, in a way, to be a little bit fair to them, the Graduate School Research Academy changed its level of rigor in the 1980s, in the 1990s. They increased the expectations for what scholars should be able to do. And they set at the base floor, you have to speak local languages and you have to go visit those areas. You have to talk to local peoples. You have to consult local research institutions, right? And those 4 things alone discredit a lot of the research from some like armchair anthropologists and, grassroots intellectuals who are writing. pretty much between the mid 1970s and some of the early 80s, all the way back to the 19th century. And the problem is that many Afrocentric scholars relied on those people's work. So it's fruit of a poisonous tree. And then you're in the difficult position of trying to prove that these things are true. But then once you start discussing and learning about the languages, you realize like these claims, they don't stand up to scrutiny. Now, just in terms of Dr. Van Sertima's work, like in any culture, people leave loan words, especially for tech. So like, what's the word for iPhone in Mexico? iPhone. Because yeah, you couldn't get to your button fast enough.
I was trying to. I'll make sure I participate. iPhone.
Yeah, iPhone. So it's like it's a great example. Everywhere we look in world languages, when one culture group moves into a region with another culture group, they share loan words because one group has something the other group doesn't. Right? Now, we look at West Africa. West Africans have been mining and iron and smithing and manufacturing iron products for a very long time. We think maybe 3,600 years ago is some of the earliest dates we have of furnaces that have been discovered by archaeologists. Everywhere West Africans went, they took blacksmiths with them, everywhere. The people in the Mande speaking world in the Mande heartland, which is around present day Bamako, the capital of Mali, they expanded all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and everywhere they went, they encountered societies that didn't have iron. How do we know that? Because all those societies have Mande iron words for iron. So these loan words are important, and this is just one example, but like it's unfortunate that, there's a good side to what Dr. Van Sertima or some of these other people, did, because it opened other people up to the possibility of studying Africa more rigorously. Like that's positive, but their methodologies had not been made more rigorous yet by the way people study these topics. So now it's much more rigorous.
Before you
go ahead.
Before you move on, each one wants you to explain or expound on loan words so people can get the context of that, because a lot of people don't know it, and each one just set a doggone monumental gem down just now for that one. So we need to know what loan words are.
Yeah, so a loan word is a word in one culture that is borrowed by another culture during contact. So if I'll use the iPhone as an example. An American buys an iPhone at the Apple store, and then in 2007, let's just use a historical example, travels to Mexico City, gets a call, begins answering it. When they hang up from the person they were calling or who called them, a person standing next to them who's a Spanish speaker, a Mexican, says, "What's that?" The person who has the phone says, "It's an iPhone." The Mexican who's asking the question says, "Oh, it's an iPhone." Bang, the word spread. That's an iPhone. You better get one of those. They didn't use a Mexican word, a Spanish word, right? Or an Aztec word, or a Mixtec word, or they didn't use a local language, because why? In local languages, this is just how linguistics works. They're less efficient. If I were to say, well, how would I translate an iPhone into, like Aztec or Mexican Spanish? It might end up being something like the silver box that allows me to call somebody else. That's a whole lot of words. It's just easier to say iPhone. The same happened with ironworking. So we know all the terms for iron in Mande societies come for the most part, from the Bamana speakers. And as their technology spread on how to smith iron, how to smelt iron, local societies, like even cultures that weren't Mande speakers, like there's a group of people north of San Luis, or it looks like St. Louis on the map of Senegal. It's in northern Senegal. People north of there, They don't even speak a Mande language. Why do they have a Mande term for iron? Because that term was loaned to them by another culture. And when you think about it, not everyone, oh yeah, somebody saying, why are Spanish or Russian soccer players saying goal? Exactly. That's a loan word. And so loan words are important. They happen now. Where do loan words show up in our languages? They tend to show up around rituals, right? And rituals. So you think, well, what rituals do we have? Well, happy birthday is a ritual. The whole world knows 50 Cent version. The whole world knows Stevie Wonder's version. Happy birthday to you, right? Right. The whole world knows that. How is that possible? Well, we always brag about Black culture and African American culture like spreading globally. And like, yes, it's true. Why is that? Because there's something joyful about the way that we do that, right? So that's a loaned ritual. Now, other societies celebrated birthdays, sure, but they might not do it that way. Or maybe it's the way that some Eastern and Southern European cultures, like they throw plates at weddings, right? And then other adjacent groups living next to them adopted some of that practice. But when we mimic someone doing that, we say "opa," because that's the language term that's loaned to us from that culture. Like the United States is really good for this because we're a diaspora of immigrants. Of course, like our ancestors weren't immigrants, but there are immigrants from all over the world that have lent different loan words into our society. Pizza is a loan word, right? So hopefully that makes it clear. A loan word is loaned from one culture into another culture, and during contact. The during contact is huge. It doesn't happen without contact, and usually people adopt it because it's easier to explain than something else. The word PC is used all over the world for a personal computer, but many of these societies they're not Latin language based, they're not English based, but there's a lot of English loan words business. I went to South Korea twice. South Koreans use the term business as an English word because there wasn't a good corollary in Korean. It didn't mean there wasn't any word. There could have been terms for these things, but maybe they weren't as efficient. So hopefully that helps. Tika, you up next?
Yeah, Dr. Ian, I've been trying for a minute. I do apologize. Been having like technical difficulties, but
No
primarily
worry.
speaking, I'm glad that you went into a lot of what me as a social scientist like to talk about all the time, which is cultural diffusion and cultural continuity. This is how you can realize how civilizations touch one another. Now, you briefly spoke, you just stated that, that we weren't immigrants. We were trafficked, if you will, into this hemisphere, via the transatlantic slave trade. So we just wanted to go ahead and make that, kind of crystal clear. I wanted to go back to something that you keep mentioning, which is these specific fraternities that were in West Africa. When one of the frustrations that I had most recently was watching an interview that was done between Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens, where he literally started talking about the way in which Europeans brought culture and civility to these savages that were in West Africa. That they had no culture, they had no technology, no any of those things. Now, I'm glad that you spoke at length about the things that we were doing at that particular point in time. And in your research on Western African civilizations, you highlight the significance of gilded fraternities and their role in shaping social, political, and spiritual life. Could you elaborate on those fraternities, how they function as custodians of culture and skills, and what specific evidence of their influence or continuity can we trace within the African diaspora in the Americas? Because I think that's really important for people to understand is that our societies were more than civilized. also technologically driven. And I would love to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. I would say that, African societies developed what we call power associations. This book that's on the screen was written by one of my doctoral thesis advisors, Patrick McNaughton. Like, I know him really well. And he writes about some of these, and then my doctoral thesis wrote about one society in particular. So in the Mande speaking world, I mean, I'll talk beyond the Mande world, but in the Mande speaking world, you basically had seven secret societies or power associations that a person moved through during the course of one's life. When between the ages of 7 and 13, you were often a member of one power association, and it initiated young people toward adulthood, but it taught them certain roles and responsibilities in the community. Right. And then when you turn 13, if you were male and you hit puberty, then at that time, you were taken to a sacred grove by a masked dancer and members of this power association, which is kind of like a fraternity, right? And in that sacred grove, you basically went to what we would call school, for lack of a better term. It was a formalized educational process where you were taught how to heal certain types of wounds, for instance. You were also taught what the kind of political obligations were that you would have as an adult. West African societies, if you were an adult who was initiated, then you had a right and obligation to vote whenever the community came together to discuss a referendum. So in other words, people are like, we want to ditch our ancestral religious practices. We're going to vote on it as a community. And people voted with their feet. If they didn't like the outcome of the vote, then they moved away from that particular community. But it was majority rule in these societies. These spaces were called sacred groves. So in a sacred grove, you were taught many things. For young men and young women, like, you were taught how to please an intimate partner. Like, that was, what does it mean to rear children? What are appropriate and effective disciplinary practices? You were also taught a lot of the herbs and different concoctions that you could make from the bush that could stop bleeding, for instance. So it was what we would call a liberal arts education. And once you were initiated, there were rules. There were things you were not allowed to tell people who were not initiated. And now the rub for African organizations like this is that they often were not strictly one gender or another. So in the Como Society, which is a society I study, almost all the members of it were male. But the wife of the chief of the Como Society was a woman, and she was a potter, and she made pots that could ritually protect the poisons that the secret society developed. But they didn't just develop poisons, they developed antidotes. So if you violated some of the tenets of these societies, some of the consequences could be quite dire, up into and including death. If you slept with a brother's wife, someone else who was initiated into this power association, if you slept with that person's wife in this male society, then the penalty was death, right? On the lower end, if the masked dancer is performing and the dancer's shadow crosses your shadow, then you would be poisoned with the male poison. The male poison you could recover from, but the female poison you couldn't. It would kill you, right? And I write about this in my doctoral thesis. So these secret societies saw themselves as keepers of cultural flame, but also keepers of ritual practice. And they were also keepers of business, which I think is a real lesson for us. These secret societies, like the Como Society, if you wanted to become a merchant, you needed to be initiated into this organization. Now, Como was anti-Islam, which ruled out Muslim merchants. So if you converted to Islam, then you basically could not participate in this secret society. But these secret societies played a huge role in like educating young people and stewarding them toward a meaningful adulthood. That they are also merchants. They knew where all of the trade routes were to get to certain types of commodities. They knew which villages to direct people to in order to, acquire the things they needed to sell in the market or to sell as a service. So these, the Como society was run by blacksmiths. So blacksmiths in the Mande world became they basically became the people who controlled access to Mande culture. They're very powerful. They were not, though, all powerful. Like griots and praise singers were not allowed to join the Como society. The Como society had its own praise singer internal to it, and they had their own praise songs that are in coded language that is called secret speech. Right now, but when you look at others, other cultures outside the Mande speaking world, we still find power associations are very important. Find certain types of merchants. There's like long distance traders. There's like local marketeers. Like there's a whole range of things that needed to be made in everyday life. Leather goods. I referred to some of them: gold, copper, baskets, pottery. All these people are in guilds. I call them power associations, but they were guilds. And the reason why they were in the guild was to protect their trade secrets. Like in classical China in the dynastic period, you see guilds of pickpockets, and they were in every city or town. And they taught people how to steal stuff and pick people's pockets. Like guilds are something we find all over the world. In West and Central Africa, they come to play this important role. They're less important in Central Africa, more important in West Africa, which leads to a point I want to just put a pin in and I'll stop, which is every region of the African continent developed different cultural practices. So there's 5 regions of the continent, and those cultures in those regions are different. They're different from people in adjacent regions. Some of the values expressed might be similar, but the way they put them into operation could be totally different. But when Europeans, and for the most part in American education, when we hear Africa, we make assumptions about the continent as having largely the same cultural values, and therefore maybe they're the same historical developments, but they develop dramatically differently. People in the rainforest zone, even in one region within West Africa, you've got the Sahel zone, you've got the Saharan zone, you've got the rainforest zone. In those 3 zones, cultures develop differently. So there's a lot of differentiation that emerges in African history, and it's an important way to study the continent. So when I teach about Africa, I talk about the region separately because that's important.
Okay, thank you so much. I mean, you went into great detail in regards to that. And for me, I always like to talk about cultural continuity. So my next question is that how does it show up? It shows up in the African diaspora that is, coming out of West Africa. So when we see those specific skills, the mask making, the things like that, um, for example, I wanted to, because we got quite a few questions, but I want to try to condense a lot of what we have because what time that we have left. So I just wanted to touch on like a little bit on my second question and a little bit on my third, which was about the African descendant communities in the Americas. How they retain those intricate like craft traditions, like the spiritual systems, the codes of brotherhood that were
Yeah.
reminiscent in those West African guilds. Like, in what ways do we see that, being practiced in all of these different cultural, these different communities that we have today in the Western Hemisphere?
Wow. I mean, wow, that's a great question. I think I'll give it maybe a somewhat of a short answer, but I'll say that. So when Europeans took mature adults from Africa in the transatlantic slave trade, I mean, you've probably seen memes about this. They took engineers, they took healers, they took blacksmiths. We know that there are accounts of some blacksmiths who are African in the antebellum period who are highly skilled. I grew up in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which is like one of the top 3 genealogical like repositories in the country, right? You want to learn about family history, that's one of the places you can go in the country, and they have records from the whole country there. And while I was researching my family tree, I found a blacksmith on a neighboring plantation to one where, or forced labor camp, to next door to one where a member of my family lived. And that blacksmith was worth $3,600 on that year's slave schedule. Right. So just digging into genealogy for a quick smidge, a slave schedule was a listing of all the property on a quote plantation, right? But they didn't name any of the people. Like enslaved Africans were rarely named on a slave schedule. They were only named in legal documents if they were given as a gift to, say, like the daughter of a slave owner got married and her father gave her 10 slaves, right? Then those slaves would be named, because they had to be named for legal reasons, because if they were just a shoebox, right, 10 shoeboxes don't have any differentiation. So how would she be able to trace her document of ownership? And so on this slave schedule, this enslaved person was worth $3,600. And I just Googled it, and don't quote me, but $3,600 in like 1814 US currency was a lot of money. Like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars was the worth of this person, because blacksmiths, they made horseshoes, but they also made implements to enslave, to shackle and torture other Africans who were enslaved, or people of African descent, African Americans, etc. So they also made and repaired plows. So we know that some of the people who came from West Africa, like, those were things that they did. Many of the women and men who came from Sierra Leone and Liberia, I mentioned earlier, were rice growers, and they were highly skilled. And eventually slave owners realized they wanted people from that region because for that very reason. And so like Carolina gold rice, which is really famous, especially in Gullah Geechee territory, is like, that's a direct byproduct of the skill those people had. Even, Gullah Geechee basket weaving, the whole 9 yards, like we know that's traced back to West Central Africa.
I do have a slide on that. I don't know if Khalil can bring that up. It should be slide number 6. It's showing an illustration of what exactly is you're speaking of, which is goldsmithing in I think it's about 18th century North America. I also have there, and I'm just showing this basic bit of cultural continuity. Yeah, you see the Gullah Geechee basket as well. Also, you see some of that mask making that is directly from West Africa through Jankuno. This is the Jankuno masks that are done in Jamaica, Bahamas, and other parts of the diaspora as well. And so it's just showing that level of continuity that came from West Africa into the Americas, because where would they have gotten the skill to learn all of these things?
Yeah, and I'll just expand really quickly on that. If you all haven't seen the first 2 seasons of the Netflix show High on the Hog, it's all about African influences on American cuisine. Powerful. And in terms of there are lots of other forms of continuity. These are often referred to as Africanisms, which, so some people assumed for the longest time that Black people, that our African ancestry and cultural heritage was completely erased by the transatlantic slave trade, but we know today that's not true. Like the way that we say, you hear, Jay-Z saying we in the building, and the word building has a G at the end of it, but he's removed it. And that's because of tonality, West African tonalism in our linguistic practice has survived the transatlantic slave trade across many generations down to the present. The way that language is a part of this. Mask and masquerade, hugely important. I mean, in the U.S. Virgin Islands, you got Mako Jumbi, these stilt dancers that also are masked often. So we see these, and of course, there's New Orleans. And in New Orleans, we saw a combination of African masquerade practices with, some Native American and Creole practices. And there's, of course, New Orleans is a point where the Caribbean is constantly being reintroduced into the United States. And so, yeah, all of these things are continuities. I'll just say, just really briefly, so I learned Bamana at one point. I'm good enough at Bamana if I listen. When I go back, I have to listen for a week. But I can speak fluently for an hour and 45 minutes before people realize I'm not a native speaker. It's not one of my, birth tongues. And, I remember one day I was in a compound and the little boy was he was fake crying. He was, and I just in Bamana, it didn't even occur to me. In Bamana, I said, do you want me to give you something to actually cry for? And the women in that compound were pounding grain in this giant mortar and pestle, and they fell out. They were like, Bamana, yada. You become a true Bamana today. They were like, they hounded me. They were like, who taught you to say that? Where'd you learn that? I was like,
But
this was my experience.
But you see, you say it that way, African Americans say it, you said it in Bamana. In Pato, we just say, "Me give you something to cry for."
That
right?
part. It's the same. Yeah.
So it's the same thing. And I mean, that's what I'm talking about. And I think, especially in today's climate, when we're talking about all these different things where people are looking at being Black, but racially, ethnically different from each other, we have to understand that many of the similarities between us outweigh anything that's different. And just like you were referring to with the second line right there, and also with Carnival as well, we all express in different ways, but it's all coming and stemming from the same root. So
That's
yeah,
right.
thank you so much. Mm-hmm.
Oh, you're welcome. I mean, I can keep going. There are one of the best early books for this is Robert Farris Thompson's Flash of the Spirit. And in it, he catalogs Africanisms and African American, Afro-Caribbean culture in this hemisphere. And it's a 220-page book or 40-page book. Like, there's a lot there. So when people say, "Oh, we're Black American," we're not African American, I'm like, oh, interesting, because all of our Africanisms say otherwise. They thought they were eradicating all of our, cultural heritage. And there's this concept in
I'm gonna do a
European.
shaka. Could you repeat that again, please? Say it louder for the people in the back. Can you
I mean,
repeat that again?
for the people in the back, they thought they eradicated all of our African, cultural practices, but they
Just the
simply
Black
didn't.
American without the African part. Just that part. I'm very interested in you expelling on that part.
You trying to get me in trouble. See, but the funny thing is, no, I mean, for people who say, well, we're Black American, we're unique. It's like, yes, and like the and is who created the banjo? Our African ancestors in this hemisphere created the banjo. And guess what? The tonal style, the strumming style, all that's the same style that's used by griots and praise singers and bards all across West Africa. It's West African, right? The use of the types of polyphony that are used all across American rhythm and blues now, in any music genre, you name it. I don't care what it is, from rock, heavy metal, punk, all of these drumming styles, that's West African, right? When people say, oh, what about choruses? Well, there's some debate. We know pre-colonial Africans did engage in choral singing, and when the missionary compounds come into West Africa in the colonial period, that gets married to Christian hymns, right? So sometimes when you look at, there's amazing Southern African singing groups, and you listen to them, they've married kind of perfectly this European religious singing tradition with pre-colonial African singing traditions. It's not one thing, it's something completely new.
Mhm.
So those Africanisms are, yeah, but for people who say, well, we invented jazz, like, okay, there's improvisation among the griots and bars and praise singers all over West Africa, which is where our ancestors came from. Little people like, we created gospel. It's like, okay, like that singing style is also West African, right? So I'm more hesitant to say, oh, we're just Black Americans, we created something completely new. I mean, and I'm gonna go on a quick small tangent. There's a scene in the film Sinners. If you haven't seen Sinners, spoiler
Mhm.
alert, like, just mute your mic because I'm about to talk about it for a quick second. That there's this
Mhm.
scene where the primary character is playing his guitar and the whole scene fuses, and we see a Bootsy Collins style character with a star-shaped guitar, and he's playing. We see a girl twerking on a table. Like, we see all of this. I cried when I saw that scene, because that scene was like the crystallization of all the stuff I learned about African history and culture and everything I knew and embodied about Black and African American culture in this hemisphere. Like, it's all the same continuum. And I'd never seen that captured on film ever. And
It was,
it moved me. I was like,
yeah,
wow, they fuse
it was
these things
beautiful
for
to
people to
witness.
see.
Mhm.
So yeah, yep. I mean, there's other stuff we do. I'll just say really quick. Then I know you want to move on to another question or two or seven, but I'm here for it. But the thing about African people is the way we are around children. So that expression that I use, you want me to give you something to cry for, basically. The way we are in kitchens, the way Black women move in kitchens in West Africa is the same way my mother, my grandmother, my aunts move in kitchens here. It's the way that when a woman has really cooked an amazing meal in Bamana, you would say Guado Muso Waraba, woman of the amazing bowl of rice who cooks like a lioness. It's the same thing as saying you put your foot in that. You put your foot in them greens. It's the same. It's the same, right? Our funeral practices. Even I was in Mali. Mali's 80% Muslim, but the wailing that comes out of those people, the grief
Mhm.
that's expressed, like, it's the same as here for us. Like, not every culture does that in the way that we do it. Weddings, baby naming ceremonies, like, I'm telling you, like, the list is long. And then there's the genetic piece. The first time when I flew to West Africa for the first time, I took Frederick Douglass's "What to the American Negro is the 4th of July." I took that speech with me, and as the sun broke over the plain, as we crossed the continent for the first time, I pulled it out and read it. I almost get tears talking about this.
Mhm.
So I read that. The next day, my friends took me to the Central Market in downtown Bamako, and everyone was Black. Everyone doing everything was Black. Like, yeah, there were some Europeans, in Mali, of course, like, but blown away. But what blew me away the most was I'm walking through the market with my friend, and I'm seeing a man walk toward me, and he's my uncle. I'm seeing another man walk to me, and he looked dead like my cousin. I don't know him from Adam, right? This thing that's in us is primordial and it's timeless. And for people who say this isn't a part of us, okay, you keep hating on yourself until you decide that you want to do something different. But
Mhm.
these things are a part of who we are. It's a part of who we are. It's in us. And when you get to the continent and you see that, now not everybody welcome you with open arms, but don't everybody do that here? so, so,
Facts.
you know,
Exactly.
so yeah, no. Yeah, we are definitely African descended people. Definitely.
Okay. Wonderful. I'm sure there's other people, other maybe Shaka or teaching, I want to go ahead and ask you another question, but I just wanted to thank you for answering those, and it cleared up a lot of things for those of us, those people who might have a little bit of confusion, um, as of in
Good.
regards to where they come from. Okay, all right, thank you.
You're welcome.
You gonna ask yours, L? You want me to go?
Go for it.
All right, all right. So when it comes to so Dr. Aden, you're able to are you able to quickly but no, that's my section. So Dr. Aden, many don't know about West and Central Africa. African civilizations had political systems before and during European contact. A lot don't know that. And a good book, if you can give a good book to reference that, I'm pretty sure you're gonna say what I'm gonna say, but I don't even want to take it. Can you explain to our viewers how African political systems differ from Western European systems, but also their similarities?
Yeah, I mean, wow. I mean, there's so many good books. Like one book is called African Dominion. And it is, I mean, the subtitle is A History of Empire in early and medieval West Africa. And it's by a scholar named Michael Gomez, who was at Indiana University for a little bit while I was there doing my grad work.
Hold on one minute. That I didn't forgot to tell you, brother, Dr. John. We will be interviewing the good brother next week.
Yep.
Okay.
Forgot to tell you that. Sorry
Great
for the
segue.
interjection. Just wanted to bring that up.
No worries.
Right.
Yeah, great book. I mean,
Absolutely.
I will say that it really kind of catalogs West African history from an empire and kingdoms based perspective. It's very powerful. I would also say, there's a series by a very esteemed scholar. His name is Toyin Falola. And it's Dr. Toyin Falola. I believe he is the endowed chair at the University of Texas at Austin in African history. And his series is Africa. It's called Africa, and it's a 5-volume series. And the whole second volume is dedicated to African cultures, pre-colonial African cultures. There's a series, a book, and a volume, and these are all volumes like this thick, like 300, 400 pages long. And almost all the essays in them are written by continental African scholars and African Americans. So very, very powerful. He has, volumes on post-independence, pre-colonial African history, etc. So that's like a really amazing book. I would say that, I mean, in answer to the question, let's talk about political systems. Dr.
John, can I interject one more time?
Yeah, go.
You gave me this book a long time ago, and I have yet to read all of it, but it opened my mind up and opened my consciousness to the cosmology and the epistemology of African culture. The name of the book that you recommend is called Way of Death. Do you remember me asking you about that?
Joe Miller. Yep.
Yeah.
I do.
Yeah. Could you speak to that book just a little bit as far as the recommendation and what it entails?
Wow. Okay. So Joe Miller's book, The Way of Death, is about slavery in Central Africa. And it paints a view of Central African societies that's like very different from what we understand about West Africa. Like, so in the history of Central Africa, there are two characteristics that we don't really find in West Africa. One is the big man complex, and the other one is corporate trading houses.
There you go.
So when you think about corporate trading houses, think about, I mean, I'll just use think about, I don't know, like any Italian like clothing brand. So, I'm drawing like Gucci, exactly, or think about, or Givenchy, or any of these high brands, right? Of course, like a few months ago, China exposed all these brands are being made dirt cheap, but I digress because I follow China too. But in pre-colonial Central Africa, there are these corporate trading houses, and they extend trade routes across great distances, and they would trade finished goods and non-finished goods across these distances. And they're also, I don't want to use a technical term, but they're aggregating, African men into them. So if you joined a corporate trading house, you often had color coordinated clothing. You might have had ceremonial and ritual daggers, and muskets, and they would go raid in new territory so that they could expand the economic reach of these trading houses. Really, what we're talking about is a kind of crony capitalism, but Africans are doing it in the pre-colonial period. And then the Portuguese show up, and they add, and that changes the mix, right? Plus, in Central Africa, you've got different environmental climate zones. So you got the rainforest, you got the woodland zone, etc., and you got marshland, and you got savanna. And Africans basically figure out how to exploit these various zones for economic purposes. And so we see a lot of that happen. And so now that's the backdrop, right? There was a scholar, a Dutch scholar, who ended up working at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, named Jan van Sina. And Jan van Sina wrote a book, really the first book about West Central African history. I was going to put his name in the chat so you can post it out if you want. He wrote this book called Paths in the Rainforest. And it's the first environmental and ecological history of Central Africa. And he talks about how Africans basically carved economy out of the rainforest zone in West Africa and how they did it. The book's a masterpiece. So there's a prize for the top African studies book that's published by academics every year. It's called the Herskovits Book Prize. It's named after Melville J. Herskovits, who was a Jewish cat who worked at the Northwestern University. Their library is named after him. And so he's one of the early Africanists who worked in the early 20th century. And so this book won the Herskovits Book Prize. In fact, the Monday Blacksmith's book that you showed a minute ago, that also won the Herskovits Book Prize as the best book in African studies for that year. And basically, scholars come together, they read these texts, and then they decide which one's the best piece of scholarly research for the year. So that's something they do. So let's talk about politics. So in African societies, in West Africa, these kingdoms, you could live in a kingdom or a stateless society. I mentioned a little bit of this earlier. Each one had benefits and drawbacks. If you lived in a kingdom, then you paid taxes, but there was a standing army. And there were also customs officials. We know from the Mali Empire that they were stacking paper. Actually, they were stacking gold and salt and enslaved persons too, of course, for the trans-Saharan slave trade and agricultural products. But that's the four-legged stool of West African empire, is these four different types of commodities. Mali controlled the salt mines, and there are four major crossings of the Sahara, and some of them are on hard salt flats, and at the ends of some of them or along the way are these salt mines where they would make these slabs of hard salt, and they would pack them onto the sides of camels, and that salt would come into West Africa, and it was used to salt fish and other meat, and that became a way to increase protein uptake. Protein uptake increases, life expectancy increases, your immune system is bolstered, right? So you live longer. When you live longer, then you get human population concentration in certain areas, and people start solving hard problems. One of the hard problems West Africans solved pretty early on was how to make a harder edge metal. And that meant they went from pig iron all the way to steel in a very short period of time. Steel is amazing because if you're fighting with steel-edged weapons, you don't have to stop and sharpen them all the time. They hold their edge for a very long period of time. They also allow you to exploit agricultural land. So you would have axes, adzes, and hoes. Not the hip-hop type of hoe, but the type used in West Africa. So, to domesticate agriculture. And so West Africans become masters at this at a very early date. Well, all of those things, the blacksmiths are really powerful. In fact, they're more powerful than chiefs. When the Europeans are writing about it, this is something I discovered in my doctoral thesis research. The assumption was the chiefs are the ones who held all the power in villages and in political context. But today we know that it's actually these blacksmiths who were going into the homes of chiefs in the morning. They would walk down, the village lane and into the home of the village chief and tell the chief how things were going to run that day. Why? Because they initiated all young people into adulthood. That made them incredibly powerful culturally. No one else could do that. And they did that because they made all the circumcision knives. Circumcision knives are made from meteoritic iron as opposed to a vein of iron ore that exists in the earth. That made them, magical in some ways and mysterious. They also learned all the pharmacopoeia of the bush. They learned the different poisons. They were snake bite healers. One of the first books I read in graduate school was The Social Basis of Health and Healing in Africa. It's edited by a man named Stephen Fireman. It's this thick. And it just catalogs African health and healing practices before European contact. This thick. Right? So, in political terms, blacksmiths are very powerful. Now, they're not powerful in all societies. In Ghana, they were less powerful than goldsmiths. In Nigeria, they weren't powerful at all. But in the Mande-speaking diaspora, they're very powerful. And in fact, in the founding epic of the Mali Empire, there are two blacksmiths at the center of the tale. One is Sumeoro Kante, who is this evil blacksmith sorcerer king of a kingdom called the Soso. And he's a shapeshifter. He keeps a giant python in a clay pot in his bedchamber. And he can change shape like crazy. The stories, and I went to the town where he was born. I visited his natal village and interviewed the elders about what type of person he was. And they remember it being passed down. Well, he was a serial killer. He started out pranking people, and then he started killing people because the pranks weren't funny enough. And he taught himself how to smelt iron in a cave, and they took me to the cave. So yeah, I got stories for days about that Mande-speaking world, but these blacksmiths are powerful. But everyday people are also powerful. So if you are initiated in a sacred grove by one of these power associations when you hit puberty, then you have the right to vote. And this is for men and women. Now, there is typically a group of elders that would weigh the fairness of decisions. And it was comprised of postmenopausal women who had exited menopause, and also elder men. If you were enslaved in West Africa and your master verbally or physically abused you, you could file a grievance with this council of elders and you could win your manumission. You could win your freedom based on the arguments that were put forward in that council. So West African laborers were unionized. We don't see anything like that Europeans allowed to be created. And it's because for the most part, I don't want to overgeneralize, but for the most part, enslaved persons in West Africa were trading their labor for something else, and they were still human beings. Now, if you were sold into the trans-Saharan trade, then your life was basically forfeit. The Arabs and the Muslims, they could kill you if they wanted to. In most cases, they castrated African men. They developed their own form of white supremacy in North Africa, and skin privilege, and the castration of African men was a part of that, right? So we could talk more about what race and skin color were like and how they developed in these Sahelian African societies and in North Africa. We know that, there's a detailed Muslim treatise on slavery, race, and skin color that dates to the 17th century that at some point I could potentially talk about. But it's very fascinating. A Muslim is basically saying, slavery should be illegal and should not be allowed according to Islam. But all the merchants in the Muslim world use that treatise to push slavery harder, right? So that's if you ended up in the trans-Saharan trade. But everyday people were powerful too, and they could vote. And even in the Mali Empire, there were votes. In fact, Sunjata Keita, who founds the Mali Empire, he basically creates this document. I mean, I hate using a phrase like this, but it's sort of like the Magna Carta, only earlier, where he establishes all the ranks for all the people in the society, and what constitutes a just society is described in this thing, how people should interact with one another, how people should seek to honor one another, what your occupation might, what rights and privileges and obligations it might give you. It's all contained in this charter that he created. So when Europeans act like Africans didn't have political traditions, it's like, whatever, like that's what says more about you than it does, and your false perceptions of our ancestors, than it does about what our ancestors actually did. So politically, like, these things are really powerful. If you lived in a kingdom, all these things existed, and you paid taxes, and the taxes provided for a standing army. Now, during the Mali Empire, there were no guards on caravans because they didn't need them. And when very famous, Muslim travelers from North Africa, like Ibn Battuta, traveled into Mali and write about it, they're like stunned that there's no guards and there's all this gold, or all this salt, because salt at one point was traded at equal weight for gold, and so were cowrie shells, right? So West African societies were very stable, and the political systems were layered. You have this kind of imperial perspective, which gives everyone ranks, and so there's all these families that have these last names, and they either fought to support the erection of the empire, or they tried to fight against its emergence. And so you have all these ranks, but then you have everyday people who can vote too, and they voted at the village level, at the town level, at the neighborhood level, and they would have referenda like, we want to charge more taxes for this particular item, or you name it. And so in kingdoms, that's how that worked. Now, in stateless societies, it's fascinating because you also have this type of voting, but you have more family compounds and lineages that are significant, and you have mutual defense pacts between neighborhoods or between towns and villages. And of course, you have, drums allowed Africans to communicate over very great distances. We know in some of the kingdoms in Ghana, for instance, that there were drum stations that were, stationed within earshot of one another, and they could communicate very complex messaging because why? West African languages are tonal, and the drum is tonal, right? So they could communicate. When you hear talking drum, like literal, that's meant quite literally. Each one of those tones could express a word. So you could communicate across an empire or across a kingdom very quickly. We tend to only think, say, the Great Wall of China had this type of communication system, but we don't often hear that Africans were capable of communicating like this over vast distances. So we do see that too. And, politically also, I'll say, in African societies, especially in the Mande speaking world, there's like 3 tiers to the social structure. One is the nobles at the top. I've mentioned you, like warriors, merchants, traders. Warriors, merchants, farmers, excuse me. Those 3, right? And then in the next tier, think about it as side by side and not vertical. It might be helpful. In the middle group, you have casted artisans, who I've mentioned already: blacksmiths, leather workers, griots, praise singers, bards, potters, fisher folk. All these people are casted. We call them casted because it's believed that their lineage, their family name gives them the capability to master a particular occupation. Not casted in the Indian way, like where if you're in a caste, you're of low social status, and there's things you just can't do, or you're only allowed to work with garbage, right? But now there's some casted elements in the Mande speaking world that have some qualities like that. For instance, in the Mande world, there's this cosmic energy of action. It's believed to inhabit everything. It's in a table, it's in a human being, it's in a bow and arrow, and it's called Nyama. And this, cosmic form of action, let's put the word in the chat. The cosmic form of action is like, it's an energy. And if you're born into a blacksmithing family, it's believed you have the family and lineage capability to master ironworking, right? And so if you're male. If you're female, you can master pottery and pottery making, because women don't make iron. They don't smelt iron in West Africa, because it was believed that this force, every time a blacksmith struck a piece of metal, it radiated this energy of action out, and it went out of the door of the smithy. So all the doors for where these blacksmiths worked faced uncivilized space, right? Uninhabited space. They faced out toward the forest, because that's full of nyama, and you could add more energy, that negative energy there. But women were not. It was believed that this force would damage pregnancies, right? And so, but like, if you're a member of an occupation, that's the middle group, right? I don't want to lose focus. You got your nobles, casted artisans in the middle, and on the other side, you have your enslaved persons. And there are really two types of enslaved persons, but the majority of them were enslaved persons of the house. So a few people might be enslaved to a particular household, right? And each one of these groups had certain rights and obligations. But in the Mande speaking world, the people who were enslaved persons, they were members of unions, like I said earlier. They could win their freedom if they were verbally or physically abused. It wasn't a situation where you could just, willy-nilly like abuse somebody. But, and here's the wrinkle. In Chinua Achebe's famous book, Things Fall Apart, I'll spoiler alert, maybe we could do a reading group at some point. That might be something to sign people up.
That's a heck of a book, a phenomenal book.
The book's powerful. And in Achebe's book, there is an enslaved young man in the narrative named Ijeoma. And Okonkwo becomes his owner. He captures him in war, I believe. And then at some point, he gets frustrated with Ijeoma and he murders him. And the people in his community are really upset that he murdered this young man. But in some enslavement systems in Africa, they function like chattel. In this particular case, he owned Ijeoma's life, right? And sometimes people say, well, only Europeans created chattel slavery. I'm like, no, stop saying that. There's lots of societies that had chattel slavery. Now, the form that Europeans created was distinctive. Yes. Selling people's descendants in internal African labor systems, you couldn't sell a person's descendants. Like, only that person who was enslaved owed the debt, and typically they paid it off in 7 years or so, and no more than 7 years. And then they reacquired their freedom because they paid that debt off, right? And so it's important that we know that, I mean, you all know this as research rebels, like there's nuances, right? So, but in the Mande world, like these three groups, nobles, casted artisans, enslaved persons, they all had some political role to play in this society. Let's take enslaved persons. One person I discovered, I didn't literally discover, I learned about, let me put it that way. I'm not like Columbus discovered America, but I learned about when I was in Mali, was a man named Biton Coulibaly. I'll put his name in the chat. Biton Coulibaly. Biton Coulibaly was an enslaved young man, and he wanted to marry, and the elders told him no, which was a break with how things were done. And so he was so furious that he organized the other enslaved people in his union, and they armed themselves and they started raiding the caravan routes, and they took all the trade from the elders. And eventually they overthrew that society, and he became a king, right? He founded the Segu kingdom. Why am I mentioning this? Because I know we got to stop in a second. I'm mentioning this because in African societies, enslaved persons had access to high upward social mobility. In many cases, there are enslaved persons who became heads of kingdoms, empires, etc. So in African societies, you weren't limited by the social status you were necessarily born into. And there's lots and lots of examples of this. In fact, the most famous voice in almost in all of West Africa is Salif Keita, who's a singer. Salif Keita was born into a noble family, but he's a praise singer, and the nobles are not supposed to be praise singers. His father excommunicated him from his family when he opened his mouth and started to sing, but he's the national voice of Mali. His father had to recant his position, not because his son became so wealthy, because he's wealthy. He's got mansions on 4 continents, right? He's exceedingly wealthy, but it was because everyone recognized he just had a talent that very few people could match. So in African societies, like especially in West Africa, that upward social mobility is a huge part of politics. You might start at the bottom, but that didn't determine where you would end up. So anyway, hopefully that helps give you a sense of how politics work in African societies and Western civilization.
I tell you one thing, I think this whole interview helped a whole lot of things, and we appreciate you being here. We actually got some questions from the audience. Shaka, do you have them up there for us?
Yes, I do. Hold on, let me get to one of them right now. You're not gonna read yours? Okay, let me get to one.
Nope. We're good, man. We're good.
All right, hold on.
Go for it.
Yep.
Democrat. We'll go with Democrat. Can he talk about the facts and myths about Afro Confederacy? Democrat asks, can he talk about the facts and myths about the Chukawa Confederacy?
Aerochukwu Confederacy.
Oh, I said Afro. I'm sorry. Chukawa Confederacy. Yeah, I would say that.
You good. Yeah, I mean, this is one of the important states in Eastern Nigeria that emerges, during the transatlantic slave trade. It is so. I'm going to just talk about it a little bit. In the Delta region of Nigeria, there are lots of many small ethnic groups that speak many different languages. I mean, even in Mali, a few of my best friends in Mali speak 9 languages. It's not, and so in this part of West Africa, where I mentioned there's like 480 languages in this small compressed area, it's the most diverse place on earth. Let me just put it like that. There's no place that has this collection of languages. And this is the area, the elbow of West Africa is where the Arochukwu Confederacy was. And it's out of this area many millennia before, millennia and a half prior, that the Great Bantu Migration emerges and peoples the southern 2/3 of the African continent, right? And so this confederacy is important. I mean, I'm not familiar with a ton of mythology about it, other than to say that there are people speaking many different languages in this confederacy, and they realize a few things. One, they realize that their neighbors who are not as fortified against the slave trade are easy targets, and so that becomes a part of what unfolds, right? They take advantage of smaller ethnic groups that don't have as much defensive capability. And the population, I mean, there's different debates about how large the population was, but just to put a pin in it, the population of the whole continent of Africa in the year 1500 was probably about 78 million people, as compared to Europeans who were about 9 million people. So we're talking about very large population numbers, and this confederacy is able to take advantage of that patchwork quilt of peoples. But, and the but sort of important, like in this part of the delta of Nigeria, there are a lot of mangrove swamps. And so it's very difficult. Think about how you would transport large numbers of enslaved persons in a mangrove swamp, right? So there's some like physical geographic constraints that exist and ecological constraints that came to exist in those spaces. But we see raids and counter raids in the scholarly literature in this region as members of these groups try to assert supremacy over the people in that area, right? Now, if they could capture people, then they could get them to the Cross Rivers region or to the Calabar state, and that state would interface with European slave ships and slave traders, and then they would, ship those people into another part of, of the world, of the Atlantic. So, the Arochukwu Confederacy, these are some of the key topics that we would talk about in like trying to gain a deeper understanding of its role in the transatlantic slave trade. Right. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Hopefully that help you, Democrat. Hopefully that help you, Leaky. I got you. I'll ask that one next. Okay, I just seen one pop up. Rev said, ask him what's a good starting point for people wanting to learn the history of the West. I think you got it, but Rev got in here a little bit late. He probably was at work. But what's a good starting point for people that want to learn about the history of the West? West Africa specifically.
I mean, one of the best ones is the one I mentioned, African Dominion. Like that's an authoritative history of West Africa, and it's probably one of the better ones out there, I would say. Of course, if you are curious, I'll just say this: Nigeria's history is a completely different dinosaur, not in a negative way, than it's a completely different entity than other parts of West Africa, because this degree of linguistic diversity, think about it, 480 languages. How are you going to write an authoritative history of people who had 480 languages? It's extremely complex. There are very few Westerners, even of course, the British colonized and created Nigeria, right? There are even very few British scholars who lack Nigerian ancestry or heritage culturally that can study that area because it's so complicated, right? It's exceedingly complicated. But there are some good. I'm drawing a blank on the one I want to mention now, but there are histories of Nigeria. I know Dr. Toyin Falola has a good history, and there's another one that's really magisterial. It's like 500 or 600 pages long, and it's a pre-colonial history of Nigeria. So just realize, like, there's all kinds of challenges, and just as as an African American, as a Westerner, just learning to read and pronounce names is its own practice. Like it takes years to learn how to, effectively pronounce some of these personal names, physical place names. Like, and then Nigeria has its own areas of focus, right? You got Ile Ife, you've got, Yoruba perspectives, you've got Igbo perspectives, and that's just in the South. And in the North, you've got Hausa perspectives. Those are the three large groups, but then there are other groups that are very important and central to the development of Nigeria's history. And on top of that, you got Mande long distance traders who are coming in and out of the whole bottom of West Africa. They're leaving Niger, they're leaving, also Ivory Coast, and they're trading goods all the way into Nigeria and coming back, right? And so it's a very dynamic area. It's extremely complicated. And when you got African kingdoms and state systems that are rising and falling in the ebbs and flows of the slave trade. And you got stateless societies like the Arochukwu Confederacy is a decentralized society, which is why it's hard to study, right? But I mean, it's rewarding, I think, just to learn.
Before we go into the next one, we want to give you a break to get some water or something. We frozen right now. They in the chat, but that was actually one of my questions as well. But I usually before we get it back up, I'm looking at the chat right now, just make sure or looking at the Insta or TikTok, see if it comes up. But tell me what you think about this while we're waiting for him to come back up. Sure. I try to correlate. I bring South Africa and its importance and the role that America, Jim Crow America, play on South Africa and the influence of the racism that happens there that is literally carried over from the racism that happens here, and how the systems there were modeled after the systems in Jim Crow. I always try to tell people to use that starting point because of the similarities and have to kind of to get an understanding, especially for the individuals who I think we still pause, especially for the individuals who really don't understand our history and they I don't know, have like some negative experience with someone they meet from South Africa who may be kind of like, I don't know if you know what's going on when it comes to our fight on TikTok, but the FBA and all that good stuff. Okay, so what you think about that? Let me see. I think we back up. I don't know if each one. What you got? We back up? You want to pause it for a little bit? I think each one. Wait for him to come back. I'm looking at the TikTok. We still no sound.
Yeah, it looks like we're frozen.
Yeah, we're still frozen.
I mean, I can talk about it.
Okay, I'm gonna wait. Each one, can you hear us? He's on mute. Sorry, TikTok froze. So I could ask him what books can we use to get a better understanding. So we're gonna get to the they want to know what books again when we close out. You got like, so when we come back, whenever you close out, I don't know if you want to see your memory. Huh?
Did you see what I put in the chat?
No, sissy, where at? Which one?
What's up?
I'm looking at 3 screens. It says no sound. No, sis, you put a, can I close out with my question on the youth? Yeah, for sure. And when he's done, I think because Leaky had had a question about some jelly or something like that. Would you put jelly on?
People in my family put jelly on grits, and I catch hell over that.
Oh my God!
Okay, here we go. We back up on
look. You're a guest, sir. I don't want to look. I don't want to overstep. I ain't never though.
All right, so we back up on TikTok.
Okay, good. Yeah, we're back up. We're good.
Leaky is wild. Leaky wild for bringing that up.
YouTube check right now. You guys on the YouTube channel, can you hear us on the YouTube? YouTube check real quick. Mic check. YouTube. We good on TikTok?
Yeah. I think we're good on TikTok.
Yo, we good.
Okay, all right.
Hey, yo, Leaky, you wild, bro.
I was trying to wait for a little bit. My boy,
yo, he a wild boy.
Just keep that one in your bank, in your memory bank. Tika's gonna close out with a question, but also to ask with Rev. So you guys are off. I was asking him if it was, you guys know when we're on TikTok, I always try to hit these jokers with the comparison to South Africa and America and how America influenced South Africa's apartheid system from the Jim Crow, and he was taking it from there. So we're gonna start back from there, and then Tika's gonna close out. I think Teaching got some, but we're gonna get to Leaky. okay, we're gonna get to Leaky's question at the end. So go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're absolutely right. So just to segue onto South Africa for a second, the Portuguese have been passing by this island off the coast of Southern Africa for decades before they decided to actually go explore the mainland. And when they did, obviously they encountered people there, and like South Africa's history is really complex. There's groups of biracial people that emerged from the European presence there called Griqua, and Griqua, and like very quickly South Africa becomes racialized. So when apartheid eventually emerges, it's the Dutch and the Boers asking American missionaries, well, how do you deal with your race problem? And the American missionaries are like, here's how we deal with it. And so South African pass laws and apartheid emerges out of those conversations between Americans and white Southern Africans, right? And so those similarities then end up shaping, much of the rest of that experience through the founding of the Apartheid Party in the 1940s, which is a formal political party that tried to like set in political stone what had been done culturally, and historically to separate races, etc. So, in many respects, West African history and West Central African history is very powerful. It's such an influential force on the whole of this hemisphere, the Western hemisphere. I I mean, when we look, whether we're talking about Santeria or Vodun or Candomblé from a religious perspective, like syncretic religions that have Vodun at the very center, and then radiating out like spokes on a wheel, or all these influences. And even during the transatlantic slave trade, some of these influences are kind of constantly refreshing this hemisphere, because more Africans who practice these faiths are coming into, Cuba, coming into Jamaica, coming into Brazil in particular, and even the United States. So these, this story is really important. And I think you had alluded a little bit to some of the diaspora wars that have unfolded on social media spaces like Clubhouse, and also, of course, on YouTube and Instagram. And I mean, I'm familiar with those conversations, and in a way, they're disheartening, because like colonialism did a number on continental Africans, and there are many things about African history that continental Africans are simply not taught in their educational system. And if, and I'm saying if, I know it to be a bit true, but you get busy living a modern life, and as a parent, you may not have an opportunity or take the opportunity to teach your children all of the things they need to know about what came before, right? So there are many young people from continental Africa that are unaware of some of the detailed nuances of African history. And it's like, and I don't say this from any sense of like lording it over anyone, but I may know more as an African American who studied African history formally. I may know about some things that other people don't know about in their own society. That's not it shouldn't reflect badly on me, which is why I'm always delicate when I talk about it. This is a byproduct of white supremacy and colonialism's efforts to keep us divided, right? And so I always try to like gently, sometimes continental Africans, I mean, I've been in rooms where Nigerians have said Africans never sold, our own people. And I'm just like, well, you just don't know the history. Like, yes, that did happen. It's uncomfortable. But if we live in an evidence-based world, and that's the approach that we take towards studying the past, then we need to be able to have difficult conversations. I mean, I
Most
see some.
definitely.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Was everybody complete with their question? Teaching, did you want to go before me or not?
You guys got it. I was just up here for logistical support, so you good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, brother. All right. Now, I'm glad that you touched on that particular aspect of what we're speaking of when it comes to, the quote unquote the diaspora wars, which is, like we battle with that on a seems to be on a daily basis on this app. But I'm glad that we had this particular discussion today, because really, when we're talking about West Africa and you're talking about the history, we saw a lot of the continuity. We saw a lot of how, we basically carry, because my favorite thing to say is that culture carries. And we see culture that's coming from West Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa in all of the Africanisms that we possess within the Western Hemisphere. Whether you're coming from, you know, um, North America as a Black person, the Caribbean as a Black person, or South and Central America as a Black person, there's certain Africanisms that you are in tune with because those are your ancestors, right? And
Yep.
one of the things that I would love to talk to you about is the youth. As someone who studied education, my and as a social scientist as well, I love to think about the future of our youth and the future of our people. And so, drawing from West African traditions, like what rites of passage or initiatory practices would you recommend that we adapt or revive to kind of strengthen the cultural consciousness of Black youth across the diaspora? Even what you're talking about, like even on the continent, even in North America, even in the Caribbean, because you are right, with this modern life and lifestyle, many people are not passing down the history of their people to their children. So one of the things that I feel that can be done is what I'm talking about right here, which is all those cultural rites of passage that existed on the continent. Like, what do you think that we should utilize to help promote pride, discipline, and continuity of African ancestral values with all the children of the diaspora?
I mean, wow, just so I'm of two minds about this. Like, it just walk with me for a second. On the one hand, like,
Hmm.
we have to keep in mind that in pre-colonial Africa, these were safe spaces for people to, engage in personal expansion. And the goal was for you to grow your knowledge. Um, there were even like knowledge migrations that young people would go on when they reached a certain age. They were asked to travel to other villages or towns or cities to experience what life was like there and then to come back. So, in terms of rituals, the primary rituals of initiation in pre-colonial Africa were all occurring in safe spaces where the children were being protected, right? And where the culture was allowed to reproduce itself. But that's not necessarily what we have now. And most of those rituals for young men or boys were focused on circumcision. Maybe 25% of women were circumcised, but many were not, others were not. But this whole idea of a sacred grove where you take a person and you pull them out of everyday society and you put them into a space where you can challenge them. There's no hazing that happened in those spaces, but just the idea that we're going to teach you some things you're going to need to know in order to survive. Most of that happened when a child turned 11 or 12. Those are things I think we could probably realistically replicate. And we would have just to take into account that these things that we're teaching you are unfolding in a context where you are not safe, where the world doesn't respect and see your beauty and your knowledge and, and who you are and honor you for that. And so, but these were that like initiation rituals were hugely significant. And then after a young person is initiated, then they would come out, they would have a coming out party where they're celebrated by the community. And all the elders would be there, like bigging up those children and, showing them mad respect and welcoming them into adulthood. Right. We don't have a ritual like that we do across our cultures. I mean, it might happen in some places, in the Afro-Caribbean, but for the most part, those things don't happen. But those are things we could replicate. And one of the values of it is, and there's some history that's taught in those spaces, but it's based on evidence. It's not based on, just promoting purely pride, but trying to help young people understand the value of nuance in the world. And I'll be honest, I use AI a lot, but I'm concerned about what it's doing to our thought process. And I'm concerned about that. But there have to be some ways that we could create some rituals. If you think about like what are the rituals that American young people go through? You get a driver's license, you graduate high school, right?
Hmm.
Are there, or your Sweet 16 party might be something. I know that's been all over like cable television forever. It was an entire series, where
Yeah.
very wealthy people demonstrated like they showed off their wealth. Or you've got cotillion balls, for instance, with Jack and Jill. Like these were early African American efforts in some ways, at least Jack and Jill was, to like create a initiation ritual. But I think there's some things we could consciously craft. Now, here's the other thing: travel. I know it's like hard and it's expensive, but getting outside of the United States really important. And I know not everybody can do it. But that's like, I would say that's a huge part of initiation ritual. Just seeing how other people are living. I mean, there's spaces on the continent that are really wrestling with difficult challenges that include poverty and all that's like much of that is induced by Western governments, outside governments, but also by bad African leadership choices made on the continent. It's a combination of those things. But there are spaces that are doing amazing things. Like Uganda just co-launched with China an automated air taxi. You get in it, 4 people can get in it, and you put your destination, it automatically flies you to your destination.
Be careful. Be careful, Dr. Aden. You giving too much goodness about Africa. We might get reported. Might get reported around this thing. We might get reported.
I'm just saying. I mean, all those things. You right. All those things are. It's important. Like one of the things I did, I haven't launched it yet, but I created an AI that scrapes African news sources for positive stories about the continent. Like just getting outside of our unique Western media bubble around Africa, because legacy media depicts Africa in strictly negative ways. I challenge people when I teach young people in middle schools and upper schools, and I ask them, "What's the last positive story you heard about Africa?" And they don't have one. Right? That is something we can work to break in our own homes. I know for many of you, if you're parents, your children may do reports in the summer, right? You give them a topic, they do research on it, they write about it or whatever. Like those things are important. Like teaching them how to find digital confirmation of who we are, in online, those are important initiation rituals too. And in the 70s, there were Saturday schools, right? We know like Asian communities still do this, but Saturday
Yeah.
schools were a huge part of the Black Panther movement.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things we can do too. If we live in close proximity and there's other people who are like-minded, because you need other people who agree with your general approach. That's how that reinforces itself when you talk about initiation rituals. But those are some
Okay.
things I think about.
That's a true flex
Thank
right there.
you.
What you about to say, Tina?
Thank you. I think no, I was just gonna say thank you for mentioning about the positive aspects of Africa and those images being pushed out more. So I'm glad that you're developing an AI that actually pushes and promotes positive stories that are coming out of the continent. And I will say that on this side of the world, we need that as well. We need for people on the continent to see the positive aspects of life for Black people in the Americas, because too often we are parroting things to each other that strictly come from a westernized media lens, a lens of, I have to say this on TikTok term frame, whiteness, right? So we're seeing caricatures of one another. We're not seeing us in all 5 dimensions or 3 dimensions even.
Mm,
We're not seeing our whole selves expressed. So we're seeing just these flat things, so that we're correlating all of these negative things about one another, when in actuality, like we've been stating, everything is so much more nuanced. And the way we do that is with conversation and conversations like this. This was really powerful. I'm thankful that you were able to answer my questions and the questions of the rest of the panelists. Was there anything else anybody wanted to add?
Yeah, I'm gonna close it out with before you close it out with your last and we get to his course. So the books, I'm gonna come back to the books. And again, when you ready to land it, we can talk about the grits. My boy Leaky. So my boy Mello said, from what you learned, what are some key mistakes that our African ancestors did we shouldn't repeat moving forward?
This is a hard question because some people look at like African societies being as welcoming as they were, and not all of them were, and seeing that as a negative. And I get, like, in hindsight, which is 2020, you want to guard our ancestors from having had to go through that experience of being dominated by Europeans. But there's something about Black joy that's timeless. And those people, not then, most of them aren't still here with us, but those people who tried to decimate African cultures have utterly failed. And Africa's population will be 2/3 of humanity in another 70 years. So not only did they fail, but like I mentioned earlier, like the rest of this, the last 2/3 of this century and the next century will be African centuries, undisputably. And there are Africans working to solve all the challenges that are a part of that large of a population existing. I'll just drop a few stats on you real quick, just to add the hopeful piece. I mean, Africa's population, as I mentioned, will go from 1.3 to 2.7 billion people by 2050, and it will triple to 5.4 billion people by the year 2100, when it is estimated that 80% of Africa's population will be 18 years of age or younger. And the world's largest city will easily be Lagos, Nigeria, with between 81 and 100 million people. It will be the largest city Earth has ever seen. And it will be African, right? Some people say, no, thank you. Thank you. They doing it. Look, the United States will have a population of 424 million people in the next century, at the turn of the next century. Nigeria alone will have 792 million people. The innovations that are coming out. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying that's powerful, man. It's just I want to be around to see that.
Some of you may live long enough to see it because of all the changes that are coming with AI and health and all that. I hope I live to see it, but I might not. But I would say that. Go ahead. Go ahead.
You good. Finish that.
Oh yeah.
The next question is just going to be to reiterate the books, but I want to make sure they're ready and to write it down so that we don't have to write it in the chat. And Tika's going to come back and close it out for us.
Awesome. I mean, yes.
Thank you. You need to get to your course because I'm joining your course. I just want you to know that I'm joining your course. The little lady right here listening to you, the 17-year-old listening to you. We joining the course. So
that's what's up. I mean, I'll talk about that in like a minute. I just say that, there's a young man. I'm gonna put his name in the chat. I know I need to work faster, but his name is Jeremiah Taranka. You just copy and paste that name. Anybody who's listening, or when you get a chance to, I think he might be 25 now. When he was 23, several years ago, maybe he's a little younger. He's Sierra Leonean. He was at an international innovation university in Rwanda, and he developed a device that will make clean electricity with very few moving parts on a pressure plate. You step on it, you drive over it, it creates green energy. Well, he founded his own company called Optum Energy, and he's inking deals all across the continent. He installed these pressure plates under the floorboards of the school and 9 other schools in his neighborhood in Sierra Leone, and they had free energy for 9 months. That was his pilot project. When people talk to me and they say, oh, what are Africans doing to, seize the future? I'm like, here's an example. He won the World Student Prize, which was $100,000 prize, like several years ago. So this guy, I mean, he's a young man. I don't want to call him a kid, but I'm 56. So to me, he's a kid. But there are, several African young women who are, they were teens when they developed clean water condensation devices that can eliminate diseases in the African environment and provide people with clean water. Like, these people are not unintelligent. They were the first people on this planet. Their ancestors were, right? So when it comes to is there hope for the future? I'm a glass half full guy. And in terms of Africa, I'm bullish on Africa. Africa's going to eliminate, and you got the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. African countries are trading with one another, and they're thinking about a boundaryless world where there's a continental African passport, one passport, you can go everywhere, and people in the diaspora maybe have access to that. Come on. Now, are there people who want to see Africa fail? Yeah, of course they do. But that's why we study Africa's past, so we can learn what not to repeat in terms of mistakes. But I would say the hospitality question, is really a part of my answer to you. Should Africans have been as hospitable as they should have been? Maybe in hindsight, they probably shouldn't have been, but that was the joy in those cultures and the welcoming of the stranger. And even with all the welcoming they did and all the devastation they brought against our ancestors, they have not destroyed us. We are still here.
John Henry Clark, we've been inviting to strangers, but the wrong strangers.
Wrong strangers.
All day long. And one more time to say, when you get a chance, to segue to as many those books for these people, for our people listening, what books they can get, and Tika's back, she's gonna close it out, and we can go over your course.
All right, cool. Well, I'll just say really quickly that the other things that I think that now it's a myth that Africans did not have writing. You all know that. There were African societies that developed writing before European contact, but a lot of expertise was embodied in individuals. But there were groups, like I talked about the gilded groups. You asked me about them. There were African groups that were sharing knowledge in the past. So we can't really say that was something they weren't doing effectively. They were doing that, right? My illustration of Africans making muskets and, being on technological parity with Europeans until 1884. Colonialism is beginning in 1884. The transatlantic slave trade is over. Right. So we can't use technological backwardness as a claim to undermine African ingenuity and creativity in the pre-colonial period. So I think there was a lot that Africa was doing right. And now I'll just say this, with AI being capable of translating African languages, I asked ChatGPT questions in Bamana the other day, and it answered me in Bamana. The sky is the limit on what we can create. I would say that if we're smart, and this is a whole separate deal, but standing up businesses on the continent is going to be important. There are African women who've developed last mile of the way food delivery companies on the continent, and they're doing 1 million transactions a month. Imagine what that's going to look like when the population doubles.
Yeah, that's wild. Right? That's absolutely wild. Like you said, the travel. Like I'm trying not to do my Shaka thing, but it's just so powerful, the things that you say, and we regurgitate. Like Tika said, she always said cultural continuity and culture carries. But I want to go to so much, but I would just stop it. So, but you got a buddy in here. My sister Carolina says, shout out to Indiana University grads and tell him Naptown better than the Fort.
Cut it out. I can't exactly argue with you, but I was born in Fort Wayne, so the Fort is gonna always be better than Nap, but it's not a real argument.
Gotcha. You ready, Tika?
Ready, y'all. Ready. ready like Freddie, they say. Yeah, just wanted to go ahead and end that with what you were talking about as far as Africa being the future. Both when it comes to resources geographically, when it comes to the population, as far as the youngest population on the earth right now. And pretty soon, Africa, according to trajectory speaking, is going to be the center of the earth when it comes to everything. And I know it's very hard for a lot of people to kind of conceive of right now, because we have always had this grossly estranged way of looking at Africa as if it was, different and apart from us when we, descend from there. Now, I propose this question, like I said before, because all of my questions are about the youth and the future. But I do want to extend this to us as grown people as well. So I'm just eliminating youth. Especially in today's climate, like we stated, where we have people who, have difficulty connecting to, or even trying to admit to their African ancestry, if you will. What are some strategies or programs do you believe are most effective in engaging people with their African heritage, particularly in ways that emphasize historical pride, communal responsibility, and global unity across the diaspora? I'm going to say that one part again: global unity across the diaspora. Let me ad-lib for a little bit. Because that aspect of it, the global unity aspect, is the one that is, I feel, at the forefront of the reason why we receive so much adversity as people who happen to be Black. Because they know that global unity means, end game for most people. But I'll let you go ahead, Dr. Aden.
Oh, thanks for the question. I mean, Tika, I'm gonna say something that sounds maybe a little counterintuitive because I like have a very deep desire for unity, and I also recognize two things. Africans were never unified in the pre-colonial period, and everybody can't go on the ark. Everybody can't come on the ark.
Facts.
So
I always say that everybody can't come. True, true, true.
everybody can't come. So for me, like, I, as much as I want that, I realize that the teaching of our ancestors to hate ourselves has been successful for in some people. And so I I try to bring the people that are farther along, than to try to win the ones that are dead set against it. Like they're going to come to their own, they got to come to grips with their own ancestry at some point. And I also recognize that it's such a deeply traumatic experience to have had this history. No one else in the world has this history, right? And so for some people, they can't overcome it. And that means they turn to other types of ancestry, which may not have actually been their own, based on what we know about the historical record. And I'm really moved for those people, but I also recognize they're not ready yet. How does change happen? You have to be ready for a change. And so those people aren't ready yet. I'm okay with that. I might just be another, brick in the stepping stones that lead them toward a transformation to actually see and learn more about who they were. But for some people, the idea that our ancestors were enslaved is so traumatic that they can't get past it. They can't get some critical distance from it. And so they pivot in a different direction. We were indigenous. We were always here. They might go in that direction, or there's lots of other directions they could go in. But do I pursue unity? Yes, I do. Is it achievable?
Maybe not.
Maybe not for everyone.
Hey,
Yeah.
it's one of those.
It's hard. It's a hard question.
I will say that is probably the best answer at this particular point in time, right? Is because of, like John Henry Clark often spoke about, that slavery curtain. One of the criticisms that personally I receive, or most of the team here receives, is that we talk about slavery and we talk about these things, and why can't we get over it? Because you haven't gotten over it. You have not learned to deal with it. You have not come face to face with it, and you have not confronted it. It's only with confrontation that you can actually understand a thing for what it is. Now, whether you choose to go the route of full acceptance or you choose to go the route of full denial, that is completely individualistic. But the acknowledgement that the thing occurred must be dealt with.
I agree with you, and the reason why I won't lie. Like when people ask me what words do you use to describe, the transatlantic slave trade, and I'm like, horrific and fascinating, because not enough of the strategies that Africans deployed is known by the general public. Like I'm a history nerd, so the complexity of the transatlantic slave trade is a magnet for me. And it's also a space to narrate lots of powerful stories about the myriad ways Africans and their descendants, worked to liberate themselves. It's the ultimate exploration in self-agency for me. But some people just see that as a dependency. It's not. Like, I assure you, it's not. That history alone is really deeply fascinating. So for me, I think if we don't study it, we could end up back in it. And I refuse to do that. So you're right. And I mean, in my mind, we have to learn about this past. If people say, well, you spend too much time on it, get over it. I mean, look, if we could have just made it all go away, wouldn't we have done that already? If it was as simple as just waving a magic wand and things would be different, wouldn't we have done that already?
That's
Yeah,
that's
this is
cognitive dissonance disallows that critical thinking. But you don't understand. We want to keep you so long, but let's talk about let's get
I
to
come back.
your course.
So,
Hey,
Dr. John, so are you saying we can't click our heels 3 times and our booty works with us? Is that the synopsis? That
Hey, so
Listen,
how you gonna get us on target and then you come in with you gonna get me started again?
There's no place like home. Is that what
there's
you're
no
saying?
place like home? We
but
can't.
this ain't
Oh,
this
we can't go back on the magic boat back.
this ain't Dorothy. He ain't the Wizard of Oz. This ain't nothing like that.
Oh no.
This that
Oh,
Nah, I
close.
yeah.
think
He's
I
going
appreciate
down the
you.
road.
I appreciate you, brother, for coming out. I like to say that I appreciate you, and I thank you, and you know that you're one of my mentors, and uh, I really appreciate you coming out and taking your time with us and doing all that you do. Um, we have a treat also from Dr. John. I have taken his course. I've walked through it. It allowed me the capability to open my mind, uh, to deal with touchy subjects that I didn't want to deal with. uh, some of my biases went away. Uh, it humanized who we are and who our ancestors were. And I would implore you, um, if you want, to go deeper into it, to take this man's course. I begged him to make a course, so he did not want to do it, but I told him he must do it because there is not enough, in my estimation, people who are putting out good material for people to learn about the deeper truths of who we were and who we are and who we could be. So, in that note, Dr. John, could you just give us a brief introduction about your course?
Sure. So, I created a course called Deeper African History. And, my tagline is before they lied about Africa, they told the truth. And so it is basically nine lecture series that I will basically do live on Zoom and then record. And so if you just scroll down a little bit,
Sure.
I'll just walk a little bit through the sales letter. So, but yeah, as you just scroll down, we're going to begin class on Sunday, December 7th. We'll find a good time in the evening to meet. And then after that, like, you can come for the lives. Great. And if you can't, then you can always watch the videos, and I'll do Q&A once a month, at least once a month, but I'd like to do it maybe every other week. And it's based on all the top scholarly methodologies that scholars who study Africa use. And so, I went to Indiana University, but there's a lot of African studies programs you may not know, and I hope this survives the current administration. But there are 10 Title VII African Study Centers across the United States that receive millions of dollars in funding in order to research Africa and study its past. And so I went to one of those schools. If you scroll down more to get to about the course, I'll just quickly walk through the 9 different sections and I'll talk about them really quickly. Yep, if you just keep scrolling down, and obviously you'll get access to this link so you can read through all the copy. If you want, keep going. And it's down. Go until you see my inside the course. Yeah, here we go. Okay, right there. So module 1. So how we know Africa's past. And I won't belabor this too much, but we're going to, follow the evidence, language, and artifacts to reclaim our real, actual roots. And so we'll learn about, how Africa's history was passed down without relying on European records, why oral tradition can become more reliable than written colonial accounts, how artifacts, landscapes, and ruins often speak louder than textbooks. Right, we're going to look at the archaeological record. Like, how do we know what we know about Africa? There's written legacy, there's archaeological record, there's material culture, like the things that people produced in society. How are these evidences of Africa's past? And so this is the first module. And then if you scroll down to module 2, how to study Africa right? And so
Dr.
how
John,
do you, yeah,
Dr. John, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I
no,
think this is important as far as the course is concerned, and also as far as frameworks is concerned. Often, I know that you're an expert in African oral traditions, right? And I don't know if people we kind of have need to better understand what oral tradition is, because I think people think it's like a game of telephone or something. Like that's not what oral tradition means. There's a methodology applied to it, and
yeah,
I'm gonna let you speak to it. But I think sometimes people put a lot of faith in documentation, which is fine. That's good. That's the way to record past and history in and of itself. But it's not so much about the documentation is concerned. It's about the accuracy of the information.
that's right.
Am I correct in saying that?
You are. And also, it's how you interpret the information based on what else you know, right? So, like, one source could be read in 3 or 4 different directions. That's something that you learn in graduate school. But sometimes we look at a source and we say, oh, it was written by Europeans, so it must not be valuable. And you could miss all the gems that are hiding in plain sight if you can't correlate that information with appropriate filters to what else we know from archaeology, from linguistics, right? From oral tradition, oral history, oral testimonies. So, I mean, if you scroll down a little bit, there's an entire module in this course. It's the next one, Orality and Literacy in African Life. In this one, we talk about why these are oral cultures, where are the knowledge holding spaces within African cultures in the pre-colonial period, and how do we know they're valuable? How do you evaluate oral materials, right? These are important tools that Africanist historians learn to utilize as a part of a bigger toolkit, so that we can take an observation that a European colonial administrative official might have had and suddenly connected to something linguistic or cultural that was unfolding in an African culture at the same time that we have evidence of from oral histories. Where are the oral histories kept of African societies? Newsflash, they're in graduate research libraries, right? There's a lot of people who are like, oh, the Europeans hid everything from us. And I'm like, no, they didn't. You just need a driver's license. You can get a library card at any research library in the country. People don't know that. They're like, oh, they hid this from us. Like, well, they didn't
You go to
exactly.
Naples and walk right in. They just want to see your passport. That's it.
That's it. They want to see your passport. If your passport is a driver's license, then you get a library card. You can check stuff out. And now in the digital age, you can check stuff out from those libraries for free if you live in those states.
Yeah.
Right? So you want to do research, like you want to read the books, and then there's levels. There's always levels to this, right? There's books and journal articles. There's a special type of journal article called a state of the field article. That journal article, written by a PhD usually, summarizes what the state of knowledge is in a particular topic in African history. And it's got all the references in it. I'm going to show you all in this course where to find those documents and how to read them. Once you know that, the whole world cracks open like an egg. You can find almost anything. Right? So these are all things that you can do. And so I spend a considerable part of the course doing that. Then I talk about African languages as carriers of memory. I alluded to it earlier when we were talking that African languages are operating on efficiency at multiple levels. And I'm going to break down how African languages are important and why they were categorized in the way they are. There's 5 major African language families, and you really can't understand the continent and its past without understanding those 5 language families. Inside those families are thousands of languages. And so I'm going to explore, like I mentioned it briefly, there's 2 different theories about how languages move across physical space, right? And how loan words are left. There's a tree theory and there's the wave theory. We're going to talk about both of them. Like, this is a master class. This is not, this is a whole different level of understanding, right? Module 5, geography, the land that shapes us. You can't study a place without knowing the geographic spaces and limitations. And, geography can limit a part of your destiny, but eventually Africans figured out they could import stuff from other places. So geography didn't have to be destiny, but you need to know a little bit about the geography of the African continent. So we're going to talk about that in detail. And that geography is like, I mean, we just go into long distance trade routes, how climate changes
Yeah.
created history shifts. Like,
Hey,
powerful.
If you
Dr.
don't,
Aden. Oh, my bad. Hey, Khalil, real quick. So,
Yeah.
Dr. Aden, what's geography? What is that? What does that touch on? Does that touch on the what is that? What's geography?
human beings, especially early on, not 80% of what they was doing and why they was doing is because of their geographical climate and location.
Yup.
What they were eating, why they were doing what they were doing. Like and if you don't understand geography and climate changes, then I don't know.
And I'll say that African languages allowed Africans to exploit a broader range of geographies than almost anyone else on the planet. If you know 9 languages or 11 languages or 15 languages, you can travel really widely. And this course is really a precursor because for the transatlantic slave trade, because if you think about the assumptions we were taught in school, at least I was that Africans were not capable of communicating with one another in the transatlantic slave trade. Please, there were people on those ships that spoke 9 languages, 5 languages. Those people were capable of communicating with one another.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cultural survivals. What did you say?
No, I was telling each one just in case you didn't know. TikTok went down. But go ahead. I mean, we still listen. We still got YouTube.
Okay. Yeah. So language. When we talk about geography, it really each one of these modules is connected. There's multiple trainings in each module.
That's nice.
So I'll do these live with Zoom. So we'll be walking through geography. It'll take us a couple lessons in order to get through that.
Nice.
And then the next one, module 6, archaeology, digging up proof. In this particular module, we look at what's the archaeological record in Africa. Every African country has a department of archaeology that governs what its local universities are doing and how they are partnering with universities in the global north, in Asia, in South and Central America to uncover more of Africa's past. Now, I'll just say this really quickly. Why do I always mention Africa's population is about to explode? Because Africans are going to move into places no human being has been for millennia. What do you think they're going to find when they do that? So this part of the course is preparing you to understand all the discoveries you're going to learn about in the rest of this century for however long you live. And you're going to want to know about the geographical record, the archaeological record that Africa left. And also, we're going to talk about pottery. We're going to go down the rabbit hole. How do we know whether there were, battles that took place in a particular location? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about how Africans engineered the physical world. That's what archaeology is about. And it's also about material culture. What are the techniques that they utilize, to make bronze, to make iron, to make iron art? We're going to talk about African art and architecture. That's what we're going to talk about in this. And we're also going to talk about dating. How are social scientists and scientists dating particular artifacts to give us a timeline, back to timeline for the African past? We're going to go into depth on this, and I haven't seen anybody teach a course on this at all. So this is a huge module for that. And then that flows naturally into module 7, making things, material culture in Africa. How are the different artisans capable of reaching such high levels of artistry? How did they select and identify children to become master artisans? I'm going to talk about that. What methodologies and teaching strategies do they use in order to pass this knowledge down across generations? And what role does oral tradition and oral history play in that? I'm going to talk about that. And so that's what we'll talk about in material culture. We will also look at museum exhibits. What do they leave out, etc. Module 8, ethnicity and identity in Africa. Like I touched on this a little bit tonight, but we are going to go really deep down the rabbit hole on the different ethnic groups in Africa, how people identify ethnic identity, and what are other types of identity that exists on the continent. And so obviously we've talked a little bit about the word tribe. We're going to talk about how identity existed in the pre-colonial period and how the colonial period began transforming African identities, but also how Africans exhibited their own agency to keep defining who they are and were. We're going to talk about that. How did African people govern themselves? We're going to talk about that. So it should be obvious at this point. We'll learn how your identity fits into a wider ancestral pattern of belonging. Very important. And then the last module of this course, module 9, getting ready to go deeper. So how do you take all of the things that are in the prior 8 modules, pull these together, and then how do you begin to explore the rest of the African continent? I'll just say this really quickly. There's 3 time periods in African history: ancient to pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. Those 3. And there's 5 regions of the continent: Northwest, South, East, and Central. Each one of those has its own history. So this is the gateway to learning about that. And so this prepares you. When you walk away from this course, you will know how to study Africa's past. And I buried a lot. You know how many books you're about to learn about? A whole lot of books. Every single module I have tells you, here are the books. Here are the chapters you need to know about. Here's the introductory pieces. I'm going to teach you how to read academic scholarly materials like an Africanist historian would, and also what's in the bibliography and where can you find other resources. What are the hidden websites that people don't know are a huge part of African history? We're going to talk to you about that. These are things that academics use, but they're open to anybody. So we're going to talk about that. So you'll get bibliographies, you'll get all kinds of resources in this. So that is this course.
That piqued my interest right there, because there are a lot of online things right now that sites that are being spirited away. So it'd be good to have like a lot of these resources on hand so that people can go and get this information. You know what I'm saying? So great.
Absolutely. And I'll just say a little bit about price and also the guarantee. So I feel so confident that this course will transform the way you think about Africa's past, that I have a 365-day money back guarantee. Like, I stand on what I'm standing on. And I hope that, people will, obviously you got to show your part, show and prove your part. You got to do all the work, of course, and just show me that you gave it a good faith effort. But I believe in a year's time, like, you will have plenty of time to access these materials. You will always have access to these materials. And then I also have a digital workbook that's available. I have an architectural and art history guide for pre-colonial African history that I also provide as bonuses. And so this course is $497 one time, or we do have a 6-pay. You can 6-pay and pay $97 a month for the next 6 months, if you choose to finance it that way. And so this is our course. And I will be launching the first course on December 7th. I talked to brother Khalil and I, and we thought, well, after the holiday that's coming up at the end of November, people getting together with family, etc. So that next Sunday evening, we will find a time to meet, and then we will meet. And if I'm able to offer more than one session a week, we will. But every other week, I'll drop a new Zoom call. And in that call will be a new topic. And so we will start with the first module and work our way all the way through all 9 of these modules. The total number of modules isn't determined yet, but every module I have, or lessons, but every module I have, there's at least 4 in each one of these. So you're talking about, 9 times 4, 36. You're talking about 36 different, 36 different trainings. And if we need to do more, we will. If we need to go a little, that's what I love about doing a live course. We need to go a little slower. Q&A. I will, teach, of course, and typically, I will answer questions until there are no more questions left in the room at the end of every session. So you have a question you want to get answered, you can. But if you want, you can always schedule some one-on-one time with me, and I can go in more depth and answer questions with you that way. But I believe in answering the Q&A part live. And, tonight, hopefully this was a little bit of an illustration. I know, I spent 10 years in graduate school, so I have hundreds of books in total call, and I'll refer to those texts, and I'll make sure you all have links to them. So you want to go research the text, or you want to go check them out of your local Research One University African Studies Center, like those are all options for you to do so you can learn more. It's a really unique course. I'm not aware of any course quite like this one. And so I'm very excited that Khalil asked me to create it. So deeper African history.
Congratulations on the completion of a course. Like, to complete a course, to complete something like that is amazing. So congratulations.
That sounds like an extensive body of work, and most definitely, I know a lot of people want to learn more about our history, and this is going to be an amazing rabbit hole to go down. So it sounds like it's extensive. It sounds like it's very detailed, and I think that for people like ourselves who really want to pursue more knowledge in this particular field, or to look deeper into African history, then this is the course to take. So most definitely we're going to be promoting the mess out of it. So
thank you.
Thank you for coming up with this idea and pitching it to us. It's great.
Well, I'm very excited about this. This is the base. The next course, which I don't want to give too much of the good fire away, but the next course is like Intro to West African History, or I might do North Africa first. I've taught both of these before. So North Africa looks at ancient Kemet, Egypt, etc. But West Africa is where most of our direct ancestry and lineage is. So often I do West Africa next. So that's for down the road. I'll announce that at a future date. But this is the base. Once you understand this, it's easy to level up beyond this.
Okay. Thank you.
Ready to take us out, Tika? Take us out, Khalil.
Oh no, I'm gonna tip my hat to Khalil on this one. I already asked my outro question to Dr. Aden already.
I'll address the the chat then, and I know we went down, but the fact that we got you guys in the chat, man, the fact that we got up to 100K, as you know, when you're on TikTok, when you get to 100K, that stabilizes the live. But the support and the participation, the questions, those of you guys that participated in the YouTube and help support, like, support is one of the highest forms of admiration when it comes to the people that you're dealing with and the people that you rock with. And I really appreciate it. We really appreciate it. And Khalil, this you and Dr. Aden, bro, y'all got us over here geeking out right now, man. I wish it. I didn't want it to end, but this was amazing, man. This was really amazing. And the fact that we can get as many of our people to listen to this, and like I said, some of our heavy hitters over on TikTok was listening to you, Dr. Aden, and hats off to you. And we'll be definitely getting your course. So I appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
So
amazing
Doc,
questions.
So Doc, I'm gonna put you on the spot. I know you. I think I'm about 10 favors deep now. So I'm gonna ask one more. Would you mind coming back?
Oh, come on! I love to come back.
I appreciate it.
Hey, snap!
Yeah, of course. I love talking about African history. You already know.
I already know.
Mm-hmm.
This was amazing, man.
No, go ahead, Tika. I'm sorry.
No problem. I was just commenting that this was amazing. We often don't get the opportunity to, speak at length with scholars. So this was a lengthy conversation, but a necessary one. And I really believe that it's going to do a lot of good work. So this will be forever immortalized on YouTube. And for all the people on TikTok, Dr. Aden has agreed to come back again. so we can have other discussions and he can answer plenty more questions. Um, I enjoyed myself thoroughly. As you know, I'm Mrs. Long-winded as everybody. But yeah, so I'm gonna leave it at that. But thank you once again for coming and for just giving us your level of expertise on this particular app or particular apps. Blessing us with your social media presence. It was quite wonderful.
I was honored to be able to do it.
Okay,
And as
so
we
go ahead.
each go ahead.
Okay, brother.
I was just saying, as we grow and as we get to touch more, talk and touch bases with more, and network with more of our scholars, that a lot of our people, you as you know, Dr. Aden, a lot of people don't know that you guys exist. A lot of people don't know that we have these scholars. So, with any chance you get to anyone that you are able to be in the same room with, just let them know we out here and let them know we're trying to re-spark that Pan-African flame and let people know that we want to bring the truth and get our people on the truth, because this social media and these cell phones, they're taking our people down roads that some of them you can't even come back from. So
Right.
I really, really appreciate it. And anybody you can bring to us, that'll be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I'd be honored to do that. I know some people. I know a few people. So yeah, definitely.
Appreciate you.
Yeah, likewise.
All right, each one.
All right, so we appreciate everybody that was in the chat and in YouTube and TikTok and all of the spaces. We will do a replay on this next Friday, but keep your calendars open because next week we have Dr. Michael Gomez. Dr. John has mentioned him already as far as one of the foremost scholars on African dominion and the African diaspora. So tune in for that. We will advertise that coming up next week. Stay tuned. We have plenty other coming out throughout the year. And again, we will do a replay of this shortly. Excuse me, probably on Friday. And thank y'all for coming out. Once again, thank you, Dr. John. Thank you, Tika. Thank you, Shaka. Thank the Research Rebels, affiliates, fans, and team. And got to close out. Peace and chicken grease.